Imagine the entire world map as you know it completely blank. No vast stretches of Roman roads connecting continents. No intricate Persian administrative systems governing millions. No grand imperial capitals like London or Beijing shaping global culture. For a moment, picture history without the colossal frameworks of empire that have defined human civilization for thousands of years. It's almost impossible, isn't it? Because that foundational model, that very blueprint for building and maintaining a vast, multi-ethnic dominion, wasn't born in the forums of Rome or the palaces of Persia. It was forged in the dust and heat of ancient Mesopotamia by one extraordinary figure, a ruler whose name should be as familiar as Caesar or Alexander, yet whose story is the original template for them all. This is the story of Sargon of Akkad. His unprecedented rise from obscurity to ultimate power didn't just create the world's first true empire. It established a political and strategic DNA that would be replicated, refined, and revered by every major empire that followed. Think about the sheer ambition of that. One man's vision, crystallized over 4,000 years ago, effectively set the rules for global dominance, rules that would echo through the ages in the strategies of emperors, kings, and conquerors across the globe. We are going to journey back to the very cradle of civilization to uncover how he did it. We will dissect his revolutionary approaches, from the creation of a professional standing army and a centralized bureaucracy to his masterful use of propaganda and cultural integration. These weren't just random tactics, they were calculated, interconnected components of a grand design for power, a design so effective that its core principles are still studied and applied in leadership and organizational theory today. This exploration is more than a history lesson. It's a look into the origins of power itself. By understanding Sargon's blueprint, you will begin to see the hidden architecture behind the rise and fall of nations throughout time. You'll recognize the same patterns in the news of today and gain a profound appreciation for how a single individual's vision can alter the trajectory of humanity. So let's step into the ancient world and uncover the incredible legacy of the man who invented the empire. But to truly grasp the scale of Sargon's achievement, we must first understand the world he was born into. It was not a world of unified nations, but a fractured landscape of independent and often rival Sumerian city-states. Each one Uruk, Lagash was a world unto itself, with its own king, its own patron god, and its own fierce local pride. They squabbled over water rights and fertile land, their conflicts a constant, draining cycle of minor wars and shifting alliances. Into this world of fractured loyalties and limited horizons, a child was born under a death sentence. The legend, recorded centuries later, tells us he was the illegitimate son of a priestess. To hide her shame and avoid the wrath of the city's king, she placed him in a basket sealed with bitumen and set him adrift on the Euphrates River. It's a story that echoes powerfully through history, a template for the Moses narrative that would emerge over 1,000 years later. This was not a random detail, it was a crucial piece of political branding. In the ancient mind, to be saved by a river was to be chosen by the gods. His humble, almost miraculous beginning was not a mark of shame, but a signal of divine destiny, setting him apart from the hereditary kings who ruled by mere birthright. The river did not drown him, it delivered him. He was found by a gardener named Aki, who raised him as his own, teaching him a life of humble labor. But destiny, as the legend implies, had other plans. His big break came when he was appointed as the cupbearer to King Baba of the city of Kish. This was a position of immense, intimate trust. A cupbearer tasted the king's wine and food, standing closest to him in his most vulnerable moments. It was a role that provided an unparalleled education in the intricacies of power, diplomacy, and, crucially, the weaknesses of a ruler. He saw firsthand how Baba governed, and perhaps more importantly, how he was feared rather than revered. The political situation was volatile. The Sumerian king Lugaltsagesi of Umma was on a conquering spree, having already toppled several city-states, and a palpable sense of fear hung over Kish. Ancient texts suggest Baba grew paranoid, even seeing his loyal cupbearer as a threat after a troubling dream. In a fateful move, the king allegedly sent Sargon with a message to Lugaltsagesi, a message that was in fact a covert order for his assassination. This was the turning point. Sargon, displaying the cunning that would define his reign, apparently revealed the plot. Why would he do this? It was a masterstroke of realpolitik. By betraying the king of Kish, he positioned himself as a valuable ally to the most powerful man in Sumer, Lugaltsagesi. He didn't just flee his position, he strategically switched sides at the most opportune moment, aligning himself with the rising power. But his ambition burned brighter than mere service. He didn't remain Lugaltsagesi's vassal for long. The same texts are cryptic, but they hint at a divine mandate. Sargon claimed the goddess Inanna, the warrior aspect of Ishtar, favored him. She, he proclaimed, had deserted the old kings of Sumer and chosen him as her champion. This was revolutionary. He wasn't just a man seeking a throne. He was a vessel for a divine will that transcended city-state loyalties. With this powerful ideological justification, he raised his own army. And here we see another critical innovation. He didn't rely on the traditional militias of a single city. Historical accounts state that he gathered followers who were loyal to him personally, men who ate and drank at his table every day. This was the kernel of a professional, personal army, bound not to a city or a temple, but to the charisma and promise of Sargon himself. When the final confrontation with Lugaltsagesi came, it wasn't just a battle of armies, it was a clash of ideologies. Sargon, the outsider with a divinely sanctioned mission and a personally loyal force, defeated the established hegemon of Sumer. He didn't just conquer Lugaltsagesi, he humiliated him, capturing him and parading him in a neckstock through the gates of the holy city of Nippur, a calculated act to shatter the old order's prestige. The cupbearer had become the king, the river-born infant had become the master of the world's first empire. His rise was a perfect storm of personal ambition, political opportunity, and masterful storytelling. He leveraged his lowly origins into a symbol of divine favor, used his insider knowledge to outmaneuver his superiors, and built a new kind of power base that answered only to him. This origin story, blending myth and ruthless strategy, became the first chapter in the playbook of empire, a playbook that every aspiring world ruler from Alexander the Great to Napoleon would instinctively understand. With Sumer firmly under his control, Sargon faced a monumental new challenge. He had conquered a collection of rival city-states, but how do you transform a loose coalition of defeated enemies into a single, cohesive empire? His brilliant solution was to build a brand new city from the ground up, a city named Akkad. This was a radical departure from tradition. Previous rulers would simply take over an existing city like Kish or and rule from there. But ruling from a conquered Sumerian city came with immense baggage. Entrenched priestly classes, old aristocratic families with their own power bases, and populations with deep-seated local loyalties. Sargon needed a clean slate. He chose a strategic location, likely near the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, though the exact site remains one of archaeology's great mysteries. This wasn't just about finding a nice spot for a palace. It was about positioning the very heart of the empire. From Akkad, he could control the vital waterways that were the arteries of trade and communication, and he could project military power equally in all directions. This was the birth of the imperial capital, a concept so fundamental we almost take it for granted today. Think of Rome, Constantinople, Beijing, or even Washington, D.C. These are all descendants of Sargon's original idea, a central nervous system for a vast political body. Akkad became more than just a city. It was a physical manifestation of the empire itself. Its walls were not just for defense, they symbolized a new, unbreachable center of power. Inside those walls, Sargon orchestrated a social and architectural revolution. The city was meticulously planned, with distinct districts for administration, trade, and religious worship, all radiating out from the central palace-temple complex. This was a stark contrast to the organic, often haphazard growth of older Sumerian cities. The architecture itself was designed to impress and intimidate. While we lack physical ruins, texts describe a grand palace that dwarfed any previous structure, built not with the mud bricks of old but with kiln-fired bricks, a more durable and prestigious material. This wasn't just a home for the king, it was the command center of the world. Here, scribes trained in the Akkadian language maintained records, tax collectors coordinated the flow of wealth from the provinces, and military commanders received their orders. The efficiency gained from having all these functions in one place was staggering. Instead of sending messages to a dozen different city-states and waiting for their individual responses, Sargon could now manage his entire realm from a single point. This centralization allowed for what economists today call economies of scale. Resources from across the empire, grain from the fertile north, timber from the eastern mountains, copper from the Persian Gulf, could be collected, stored, and redistributed where they were most needed. If one province suffered a famine, surplus from another could be shipped directly from the central warehouses of Akkad. This not only prevented disaster, but also fostered a sense of shared destiny, turning subjects from disparate regions into stakeholders in the imperial project. The population of Akkad was itself a masterpiece of social engineering. Sargon didn't just fill it with Akkadians. He deliberately brought in artisans, merchants, and priests from all over his empire, from Elam in the east to the Levant in the west. Walking the streets of Akkad, you would hear a cacophony of languages and see a blend of styles in clothing and craftsmanship. This was a calculated policy. By mixing populations in the capital, he broke down parochial identities and created a new, hybrid imperial culture loyal to the crown rather than to any single city or ethnic group. These people lived and worked together, their success tied directly to the success of Akkad and, by extension, Sargon himself. The capital also served as the ultimate symbol of unity and control. Provincial governors were required to spend time at the royal court, both to advise the king and, just as importantly, to be under his watchful eye. Their sons were often educated in Akkad, a practice that ensured the next generation of leaders would be steeped in imperial ideology. When these governors returned to their posts, they took back with them not just orders, but a tangible sense of the empire's power and sophistication. They had seen the grand palaces, the organized warehouses, the professional army mustering in the fields outside the city walls. This first-hand experience made rebellion seem not just treacherous but futile. The psychological impact of this centralized power cannot be overstated. For a local chieftain or a city elder, the distant king in a far-off city was an abstract concept. But the king in Akkad, with his network of roads, his swift messengers, and his ability to deploy a professional army from a single, well-supplied point, was an immediate and overwhelming reality. Sargon's innovation proved that to rule a vast territory, you must first build a heart strong enough to pump blood to its farthest extremities. The city of Akkad was that heart, and its steady, powerful rhythm set the pace for every empire that dared to dream big thereafter. Imagine the sheer chaos of trying to run an empire the size of the entire Fertile Crescent without a common language, without standardized forms, and without a reliable way to communicate your orders to distant provinces. Before Sargon, that was the reality. Each Sumerian city-state had its own dialect, its own accounting methods, and its own local officials who answered to their own parochial interests. Conquest alone was not enough to bind this disparate collection of territories together. What was needed was a system, a predictable and repeatable method of governance that could function regardless of who was in charge locally. Sargon's masterstroke was recognizing that the true glue of an empire is not just military might but paperwork. He understood that to rule effectively, he needed to see everything, measure everything, and record everything. This led to the creation of the world's first large-scale, standardized bureaucracy, a revolutionary administrative machine that turned the chaotic mosaic of his conquests into a unified, manageable state. The cornerstone of this system was language. Sargon made Akkadian, the Semitic tongue of his own people, the official language of imperial administration. But he didn't simply impose it by force and erase the old ways. In a move of brilliant pragmatism, he adopted the cuneiform writing system already used by the Sumerians. Think of it as installing a new operating system on an existing, powerful computer. The script was familiar to the educated class of scribes, but the language itself was now Akkadian. This meant that a tax report from the distant city of Susa in Elam would be written in the same language and format as a legal judgment from the heartland of Sumer. Suddenly, an official in the capital city of Akkad could read and understand documents from every corner of the realm. This was a monumental leap in efficiency. It broke down informational barriers and prevented local elites from hiding their activities behind a linguistic curtain. To make this system work, Sargon needed a trained corps of administrators. He established scribble schools where promising young men, not just from Akkad but from conquered territories as well, were educated in the imperial curriculum. They learned to read and write Akkadian cuneiform with perfect uniformity, and they were drilled in the standard procedures for recording taxes, inventorying temple stores, and documenting legal proceedings. This was more than just vocational training. It was a form of ideological indoctrination. These scribes became the backbone of the empire, a class of civil servants whose primary loyalty was to the system itself and to the king who embodied it. They were the human circuitry that connected the central processor in Akkad to the farthest peripheries. To manage the provinces, Sargon installed his own loyal governors, often chosen from his own family or trusted military commanders. But to prevent these governors from becoming little kings in their own right, he embedded them within this bureaucratic framework. They weren't given free rein, they were accountable to the central administration. They had to submit regular reports on their region's agricultural output, its tax revenues, and its military readiness. Their activities were monitored by royal inspectors and auditors who traveled from Akkad, ensuring that the king's will was being executed and that no one was siphoning off too much wealth or power for themselves. This system of checks and balances, of written accountability, was a powerful deterrent to corruption and secessionist ambitions. Perhaps one of the most tangible and impactful standardizations was in the realm of economics. Sargon introduced uniform weights and measures across the empire. Before this, a shekel of grain or a mina of silver might have a slightly different value in than it did in Kish, leading to constant confusion, disputes, and opportunities for fraudulent trade. Sargon decreed a single official standard. He had master sets of stone weights and volume measures created and distributed to marketplaces and administrative centers everywhere. This had an immediate and profound effect on commerce. A merchant from the Levant could now travel to Mesopotamia with confidence, knowing that the weights used to measure his goods in one city would be the same in the next. This predictability dramatically reduced transaction costs and friction, supercharging long-distance trade. It integrated local economies into a single, empire-wide market, fostering a level of economic interdependence that made the entire structure more resilient. Wealth flowed more freely, and with it, taxes flowed more predictably into the royal coffers, funding everything from the standing army to the grand public works projects. We can see the success of this system in the archaeological record. Thousands of clay tablets from this period, found at sites like Tel Brak and Gassur, show an astonishing uniformity. They use the same formulae, the same accounting conventions, and the same Akkadian language to record everything from the distribution of rations to workers to the complex logistics of military campaigns. These aren't the unique literary works of individual city-states. They are the dry, repetitive, and incredibly powerful paperwork of a functioning state. They reveal an empire that knew how many bricks were needed to build a fort, how much barley was in its granaries, and how many soldiers were stationed at a remote outpost. This was governance by information. The legacy of this administrative blueprint is almost immeasurable. The Persian Empire's satrapies, with their royal secretaries and standardized tribute assessments, were a direct evolution of Sargon's model. The Roman Empire's intricate system of provinces, procurators, and census-taking followed the same fundamental principle. That widespread dominion cannot be held by force alone, but must be managed through a reliable, scalable, and literate bureaucracy. Sargon proved that the pen, in the form of a stylus pressing into wet clay, could be mightier than the sword for building something that lasts. He demonstrated that sustainable power is at its core an administrative challenge. Now, holding a vast territory is one thing, but defending it and expanding it requires an entirely different kind of tool, a tool of organized, overwhelming force. Before Sargon, warfare in Mesopotamia was a seasonal, almost ritualistic affair. City-states would raise militias from their farmers and craftsmen when a conflict arose. These men were part-time soldiers, more loyal to their local city and its god than to any overarching ruler, and they would return to their fields after a battle. Sargon completely shattered this model. He realized that to secure an empire, he needed a force that was always ready, always loyal, and always under his direct command. This was the genesis of one of history's first professional standing armies, a revolutionary institution that became the steel framework upon which his empire was built. This army was not a temporary gathering of citizens. It was a permanent class of full-time soldiers whose pay, food, and equipment were provided directly from the royal treasuries of Akkad. Their allegiance was not to a patch of land or a local temple, but to Sargon himself. He was their patron and their commander-in-chief, the source of their status and their sustenance. This created a bond of personal loyalty that was far stronger and more reliable than the conditional loyalty of a city-state militia. These soldiers trained together constantly, developing a level of discipline and unit cohesion that their part-time adversaries could never hope to match. They lived and fought as a single, integrated machine. A key to their effectiveness was technological superiority. Sargon's armies were among the earliest to widely deploy the composite bow, a technological marvel of the ancient world. Unlike a simple wooden bow, the composite bow was made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, glued together and cured for maximum power and flexibility. This weapon could shoot an arrow with significantly greater force and over a much longer range than anything the Sumerian city-states possessed. On the battlefield, this meant Sargon's archers could unleash a hail of arrows on enemy formations long before those enemies could get close enough to engage with spears or axes. It was a force multiplier that allowed a smaller, more professional force to dominate a larger, but less organized militia. But weapons and training are useless without a way to feed and move the army. This is where Sargon's genius for logistics truly shone. He understood that an army marches on its stomach. To enable his forces to campaign for months or even years far from the agricultural heartland, he established a sophisticated supply chain. Donkey caravans, organized and protected by the state, would continuously shuttle grain, dried fish, and weapons from central depots to the advancing troops. He also pioneered the use of military colonies. In newly conquered or strategically vital territories, he would settle groups of his veteran soldiers on plots of land. These men were not retired, they were reservists and a permanent garrison. They would farm the land to support themselves and their families, but they remained ready to muster at a moment's notice. This system served two brilliant purposes. It secured control over rebellious regions with a loyal population, and it created a network of fortified supply bases that could support main army units on the move. This logistical web meant that Sargon's army could operate deep inside hostile territory without being tied to vulnerable supply lines stretching all the way back to Akkad. He also mastered the art of integration. When he conquered a new city-state, he didn't simply slaughter all the defeated soldiers. Often, he would offer them a choice: join my army and share in the spoils of future victories, or face the consequences. Many chose to enlist. By incorporating these conquered troops into his own ranks, he accomplished several things at once. He neutralized a potential source of rebellion by turning enemies into comrades. He steadily increased the size of his own military force, and he gained soldiers who had intimate knowledge of the next region he planned to invade. This practice of assimilation created a truly imperial army, a melting pot of different peoples all fighting under the banner of Akkad. The effectiveness of this military machine is starkly illustrated in his campaign against the powerful coalition of Sumerian city-states led by Lugaltsagesi. The old Sumerian armies were accustomed to set peace battles between city-state forces. They were not prepared for the relentless, year-round campaigning of Sargon's professionals. Historical accounts describe him fighting 34 battles in this single campaign. His army, supplied and motivated, could march and fight in a continuous sequence, giving shattered enemies no time to recover or regroup. One after another, the proud cities of Sumer Yoruk, Lagash fell before this unstoppable force. The walls of Yoruk, which had seemed impregnable to its defenders, were torn down not just as a physical act, but as a symbolic one, demonstrating that the old era of independent city-states was over, replaced by a new age of imperial power. This model, a professional, standing army, loyal to the central state, equipped with advanced technology, and supported by an unbeatable logistics system, became the gold standard for every empire that followed. The legions of Rome, the satrapal armies of Persia, even the organized divisions of ancient China, all owe a conceptual debt to Sargon of Akkad. He proved that conquest is only the beginning. The real challenge is possession, and that requires a hammer that is always in your hand, always sharp, and always ready to strike. Yet conquering lands and administering them through bureaucracy is only part of the story of empire. The true, enduring challenge lies in conquering hearts and minds. How do you persuade dozens of different peoples, each with their own gods, their own stories, and their own deeply ingrained sense of identity, to accept your rule not as a burden but as a benefit? Sargon faced this exact problem. He ruled over a vast tapestry of cultures, the Sumerians in the south with their sophisticated city-states and complex pantheon, his own Akkadian people in the center, and various Semitic and Elamite groups in the north and east. To simply crush these cultures under the boot of Akkadian dominance would have been a recipe for perpetual rebellion. Instead, Sargon pioneered a far more sophisticated and durable strategy: managed cultural integration. He understood that empire could be a collaborative project, a fusion that created something new and stronger than its individual parts. His approach was not to erase local identity, but to carefully layer a new, imperial identity on top of it. The most powerful tool in this effort was religion. In the ancient world, gods were not abstract concepts. They were active forces responsible for the fertility of the land, the success in battle, and the very legitimacy of a king. The Sumerians had a deeply revered pantheon with gods like Enlil, the king of the gods, and Inanna, the goddess of love and war, holding central places in their cosmology. Sargon, rather than dismissing these deities as false, brilliantly co-opted them. He claimed that it was the Sumerian goddess Inanna herself who had chosen him, an Akkadian, to rule over all of Sumer. This was a theological masterstroke. It told the conquered Sumerians that their own gods had turned against their old kings and endorsed this new ruler. He didn't stop there. He systematically merged the Akkadian and Sumerian pantheons, creating a unified imperial religion. The Akkadian Ishtar became synonymous with the Sumerian Inanna. The Akkadian Enlil was equated with the Sumerian Elul. This syncretism meant that a priest in the city of Nippur could continue to worship Enlil, and a priest in Akkad could worship Elul, and they were, for all practical purposes, worshipping the same god who now blessed Sargon's empire. This created a shared spiritual framework that transcended ethnic and linguistic boundaries. To physically symbolize this religious unity, Sargon appointed his own daughter, Enheduanna, as the high priestess of the moon god Nanna in the supremely important Sumerian city of Ur. This was not a random appointment. Ur was one of the most sacred sites in all of Mesopotamia. By placing his own flesh and blood at the head of its most important temple, Sargon was sending an unmistakable message. The royal family of Akkad is now the guardian of Sumerian religious tradition. Enheduanna wasn't just a political puppet. She was a brilliant figure in her own right, the world's first author known to us by name. She wrote hymns that explicitly linked her father's power to the will of the Sumerian gods, beautifully weaving Akkadian authority into the sacred tapestry of Sumer. This fusion of religious authority was mirrored in the social realm, particularly among the elite. Sargon actively encouraged intermarriage between the Akkadian nobility and the aristocratic families of conquered city-states. When the daughter of a Sumerian city lord married the son of an Akkadian general, it created a powerful web of familial alliances. Their children would be heirs to both traditions, their loyalties naturally aligned with the imperial center that their parents now served. This broke down the oldest verses, them barriers at the highest levels of society, turning potential rivals into relatives with a shared stake in the empire's success. These new, blended elites would often be educated in Akkad, further cementing their imperial identity. Alongside these policies of assimilation, Sargon was a master of propaganda that highlighted the tangible benefits of belonging to his empire. Inscriptions and royal proclamations didn't just boast of military victories. They celebrated the peace and prosperity that his rule brought. They spoke of secure trade routes where merchants could travel without fear of bandits, of standardized weights and measures that made commerce fair and predictable, and of vast irrigation projects that increased agricultural yields for everyone. This was a powerful narrative. Life under the Akkadian Empire was safer, richer, and more orderly than the constant, petty warfare of the independent city-states. Why would you rebel against a system that clearly improved your quality of life? This appeal to pragmatic self-interest was incredibly effective in fostering acceptance, if not always enthusiastic loyalty. We can see the success of this cultural integration in the archaeological record. Art from this period stops being purely Sumerian or purely Akkadian. It becomes a hybrid style. Cylinder seals used to mark ownership begin to feature motifs that blend Sumerian and Akkadian artistic traditions. Inscriptions are bilingual. The material culture itself reflects a new composite identity, the identity of an imperial subject. This was not a one-way process of Akkadians forcing their culture on others. It was a genuine, if managed, synthesis. The Akkadians adopted Sumerian learning and writing, while the Sumerians gradually adopted the Akkadian language for daily use. This cultural flexibility gave the empire a resilience that pure domination could never achieve. By allowing people to maintain a sense of their local heritage while simultaneously offering them a stake in a larger, more prosperous whole, Sargon turned the potential weakness of diversity into his greatest strength. He demonstrated that an empire is not just a territory controlled by an army, but a shared idea, and that the most enduring empires are those that can make that idea appealing to the very people they have conquered. This blueprint of inclusive control, balancing tolerance with strategic assimilation, would become a cornerstone of every successful multi-ethnic empire to follow, from the Persians who respected local customs to the Romans who offered citizenship to conquered elites. But of course, military might and administrative systems are only as strong as the economy that funds them. A conqueror can build the most impressive bureaucracy in the world, but if the coffers are empty and the people are hungry, the entire structure will collapse under its own weight. Sargon understood this fundamental truth better than anyone. He recognized that true, lasting power was not just about collecting taxes from conquered lands. It was about building an economic engine so powerful and so interconnected that the entire empire would thrive, binding everyone from the lowest farmer to the highest merchant to the fortunes of Akkad. His vision was to transform his collection of territories from a patchwork of local economies into a single, unified, and vibrant economic superzone, a web of prosperity that stretched from the Indus Valley to the shores of Anatolia. Think of it as creating the world's first version of a common market, a project so ambitious it would not be rivaled until the Silk Road many centuries later. The first and most crucial step in this process was the establishment of security. Before Sargon, a merchant's life was one of immense risk. Trade routes were plagued by bandits. Rival city-states levied arbitrary and exorbitant tolls at every border, and there was no higher authority to appeal to if a deal went sour. Long-distance trade was a high-stakes gamble. Sargon fundamentally changed this. He used his professional army not just for conquest but for economic policing. He secured the major land routes and the vital waterways of the Tigris and Euphrates, garrisoning soldiers at key crossroads and river ports. For the first time, a caravan loaded with goods could travel from one end of the Fertile Crescent to the other under the protection of the imperial crown. This guarantee of safe passage was revolutionary. It dramatically reduced the risks and costs associated with long-distance commerce, which in turn encouraged a massive increase in the volume and variety of goods being traded. Merchants were no longer just local operators. They became international agents of the imperial economy. Sargon didn't just protect these merchants, he actively integrated them into the fabric of the state. Many successful merchants were given semi-official status, acting as the eyes and ears of the empire in distant lands. They would report on political developments, scout new resources, and even help negotiate trade agreements on behalf of the king. In return, they received preferential access to lucrative contracts, the use of royal warehouses for storing their goods, and the backing of Akkadian authority in their dealings. This symbiotic relationship between the state and the merchant class was a key innovation. It meant that the empire's economic interests were constantly being advanced by a network of motivated, self-interested individuals operating far beyond the reach of the official bureaucracy. To make this sprawling trade network function smoothly, Sargon leveraged the administrative standardization he had already put in place. The uniform weights and measures we discussed earlier were absolutely critical here. Imagine a merchant from the distant Indus Valley civilization, a region known for its exquisite carnelian beads and intricate seals, arriving in a market in northern Mesopotamia. Before Sargon's reforms, he would have to negotiate a different set of measurements and values in every single city, a confusing and inefficient process ripe for cheating. Now, under the imperial system, he knew that the shekel weight used to measure his silver in the city of Susa was identical to the one used in Akkad or Nineveh. This universality built trust and streamlined transactions, making cross-cultural trade faster, fairer, and far more profitable for everyone involved. This created a virtuous cycle. More trade generated more wealth, which was then taxed by the state, funding further expansion and security, which in turn encouraged even more trade. Control over key resources was another pillar of Sargon's economic strategy. He didn't just tax the trade in commodities like silver, copper, tin, and timber. He sought to directly control their sources. Inscriptions boast of his campaigns to secure the silver mines of the Taurus Mountains and the cedar forests of the Amanus Range. This wasn't mere plunder. By controlling the supply of these essential materials, silver for currency, tin for making bronze weapons and tools, timber for construction, and shipbuilding, Sargon could regulate the entire economy. He could ensure a steady supply for his own military and building projects, influence prices across the empire, and use access to these resources as a diplomatic tool with neighboring states. This strategic control of the means of production gave him an economic leverage that was every bit as powerful as his army. This flourishing trade and resource wealth had to be built upon a solid agricultural foundation. You cannot feed a standing army, a vast bureaucracy, and a growing urban population without a massive and reliable food surplus. Sargon's administration invested heavily in agricultural productivity. He expanded and maintained the intricate network of canals and irrigation ditches that transformed the arid Mesopotamian plain into a breadbasket. The state organized the labor for these massive public works projects, and the resulting increases in barley and wheat yields were staggering. This surplus did more than just prevent famine. It was the fundamental fuel of the empire. It allowed for the specialization of labor. Because not everyone had to farm to feed themselves, people could become full-time soldiers, scribes, artisans, or merchants. This specialization created a more complex, sophisticated, and resilient society. The grain collected as taxes was stored in massive state granaries and could be used to pay workers on royal projects, feed the army on campaign, or be distributed to stabilize prices during a local shortage. We can see the vivid success of this economic integration in the archaeological record. At sites like Tel Leilan in northern Mesopotamia, archaeologists have found seals and sealings, lumps of clay used to mark storage jars and doors, that originated in the Indus Valley, thousands of miles away. In the ruins of Akkadian administrative buildings, tablets list goods arriving from Elam, Dilmun, and Anatolia. These are not the records of occasional, exotic gifts, but of routine, large-scale commerce. They show an economic system that was not just functioning but thriving, connecting regions that had previously existed in relative isolation. This created a profound interdependence. A disruption in the tin supply from the east could affect bronze smiths in the west. A poor harvest in the north could be offset by grain shipments from the south. This interdependence made secession a much less attractive prospect for a provincial governor. Leaving the empire didn't just mean defying the king. It meant being cut off from a vast, protected, and prosperous economic network. Sargon's economic blueprint proved that an empire is ultimately a shared financial venture. By creating the conditions for unprecedented prosperity, by weaving together the economic fates of diverse peoples, he built a foundation for loyalty that was far stronger than fear alone could ever provide. He demonstrated that the most enduring empires are those that make themselves economically indispensable. Now, consider a different kind of weapon, one not made of bronze or wielded on a battlefield, but crafted from words and images, designed to conquer the imagination of an entire population. Sargon understood that raw power could force obedience, but only a compelling story could inspire genuine loyalty. This is where he pioneered the sixth element of his blueprint, the strategic use of propaganda and the deliberate cultivation of a god-like personality. In an age without mass media, he became a master of shaping his own narrative, transforming himself from a powerful king into an almost mythical figure chosen by the gods themselves. The most famous example of this is the text known today as the Sargon legend. This wasn't just a dry historical record, it was a piece of political storytelling engineered for maximum impact. It begins with his origin, telling how he was the illegitimate son of a priestess who set him adrift in a basket on the Euphrates River. This story is incredibly significant. For the ancient Mesopotamians, a river wasn't just water, it was a life-giving, divine force. To be saved by the river meant you were protected by the gods, your life spared for a grand, preordained purpose. This narrative brilliantly reframed his humble, potentially shameful origins into a powerful symbol of divine favor. It was a story designed to resonate deeply with the common people, suggesting that he was one of them, yet uniquely touched by destiny. This was a stark contrast to the hereditary kings of the Sumerian city-states who claimed power simply through bloodline. Sargon's legend implied that his authority came from a higher, more legitimate source. But the propaganda machine didn't stop with his birth story. Royal inscriptions carved on stone monuments and clay cylinders placed in temples across the empire consistently portrayed him as invincible, just, and pious. They didn't just list his conquests, they framed them as a divine mission. One famous inscription boasts, Sargon, king of Akkad, was victorious in 34 battles and destroyed their city walls. He made the ships from Meluhha, the ships from Magan, and the ships from Dilmun tie up at the quay in front of Agade. This isn't just a military report, it's a statement of global dominance and divinely sanctioned prosperity. It tells his subjects that under his rule, the entire known world comes to their doorstep, bringing wealth and prestige. The message was clear: loyalty to Sargon means sharing in this boundless success. Art and architecture became powerful canvases for this symbolic messaging. While we have few surviving statues of Sargon himself, the artistic style of the period shifted dramatically. Art was no longer primarily about worshipping local city gods. It began to celebrate the king and his imperial achievements. Cylinder seals, used by officials to stamp documents, started to feature motifs of military victory and royal authority. Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, took this to another level with his famous victory stele, which depicts him not as a mere mortal king, but as a giant, godlike figure climbing a mountain, wearing the horned crown of divinity, with his defeated enemies crumbling before him. This visual language, likely pioneered under Sargon, taught people to see the emperor as a superhuman presence, a bridge between the world of men and the realm of the gods. This visual propaganda was reinforced by the state's religious apparatus. Sargon skillfully co-opted the priestly class, turning them into amplifiers of his cult of personality. As we saw, he appointed his daughter Enheduanna as the High Priestess of the most important religious position in Sumer. She wasn't just a political appointee. She was a brilliant poet who used her sacred authority to compose hymns that explicitly fused her father's power with the will of the gods. In one of her hymns to the goddess Inanna, she writes, "It is you who have appointed the king, who have given him the scepter to shepherd the land. By having his own daughter, a high priestess, declare that the gods themselves had chosen Sargon, he created an almost unassailable theological argument for his rule." The priests, in their daily rituals and public ceremonies, became de facto ministers of propaganda, disseminating the official narrative to the devout masses. Furthermore, Sargon was a master of adapting local myths to serve his imperial story. He didn't dismiss the cherished legends of the Sumerian cities he conquered. He absorbed them and inserted himself into their cosmic order. By claiming that the Sumerian goddess Inanna had abandoned her own people to champion him, he performed a profound act of psychological conquest. He told the Sumerians that their own most powerful deity had switched sides, that their defeat was not a military failure but a divine judgment, and that their future prosperity now depended on accepting him as Inanna's chosen vessel. This clever syncretism prevented his rule from being seen as a foreign imposition, and instead framed it as the next inevitable chapter in their own sacred history. The enduring lesson of Sargon's propaganda machine is that perception shapes reality. He demonstrated that to rule effectively, you must control not just the land and its resources, but the stories people tell about you. A rebellious province might be crushed by an army, but a population that genuinely believes their ruler is a divinely appointed bringer of peace and prosperity is far less likely to rebel in the first place. This blueprint for image-making, this understanding that authority rests as much on myth as on might, became a fundamental tool for every subsequent empire. From the pharaohs of Egypt, who were considered living gods, to the Roman emperors who were deified after death, to the mandate of heaven in China, rulers have always understood that the most durable throne is built in the minds of their subjects. Sargon was the first to systemize this truth, proving that the pen and the chisel and the priestly hymn could build a legacy just as formidable as any fortress. Beyond the marching armies and the bustling trade routes, beyond the grand palaces and the intricate bureaucracy, lies the true bedrock of any civilization that hopes to last, a sense of order, a belief that disputes will be settled not by the whim of the strongest, but by a known and predictable set of rules. Before Sargon, justice in Mesopotamia was often a local affair, varying wildly from one city-state to the next, dependent on the judgment of local elders or temple priests who might be swayed by family connections or personal grudges. For a merchant traveling between cities, or for a farmer whose land bordered someone from a different ethnic group, this legal patchwork was a constant source of anxiety and potential conflict. Sargon recognized that you cannot build a unified empire on a foundation of legal chaos. While he didn't leave behind a single, comprehensive legal code like the famous one created by Hammurabi centuries later, his reign represents a pivotal moment, the first major effort to impose a standardized imperial-scale system of justice. His approach was not to erase every local custom overnight, which would have been impossible and provoked instant rebellion. Instead, he initiated a process of legal integration, creating a framework where a higher, royal justice could oversee and harmonize the diverse laws of his subjects. He established royal judges appointed by and accountable to the central administration in Akkad, who would travel on circuit or be stationed in key provincial centers. These judges were not just local chieftains wearing a new hat. They were imperial officials whose primary loyalty was to the crown and its concept of order. Their very presence meant that a citizen, whether they were Sumerian, Akkadian, or Elamite, now had a path to appeal beyond their local authorities. This was a profound shift. It sent a clear message that there was a higher authority in the land, one that claimed the ultimate right to adjudicate and enforce the law. This system was crucial for handling the new types of conflicts that emerged in a multi-ethnic empire. Consider a property dispute between an Akkadian merchant and a Sumerian landowner. In the old days, this could easily escalate into a violent feud between two communities, or be decided by a biased local official. Under Sargon's system, this case could be brought before a royal judge. The judge wouldn't necessarily throw out Sumerian property law. He would likely consult it, but he would also consider the broader imperial need for stability and the protection of commerce. His ruling would be guided by principles handed down from Akkad, aiming for a resolution that was perceived as fair to both parties, and most importantly, that upheld the peace and economic productivity of the empire as a whole. This practice of blending local precedent with overarching imperial policy was a sophisticated legal innovation. It allowed people to feel that their traditional ways were respected, while simultaneously binding them into a larger legal structure that superseded parochial interests. We can see glimpses of this system in action through surviving court records and administrative tablets. One type of case that appears frequently involves commercial disputes. With trade exploding across the empire, conflicts over contracts, delivery of goods, and quality of merchandise were inevitable. Sargon's administration developed standard procedures for these cases. Contracts began to be written in the official Akkadian cuneiform, often witnessed by multiple parties and sealed with cylinder seals that identified the individuals involved. If a dispute arose, the royal judge could refer to this written contract as a primary piece of evidence. This reliance on written documentation was a huge leap forward from relying solely on verbal testimony, which could be unreliable or coerced. It created a level of predictability and security that was essential for the complex, long-distance trade that fueled the Akkadian economy. A merchant in Susa could enter into a contract with a partner in Nineveh with greater confidence, knowing that if things went wrong, there was a recognized legal process to seek redress, a process that was backed by the full authority of the state. This legal security was as important to economic growth as any road or canal. The penalties for crimes also began to show signs of standardization, moving away from pure retribution and toward a concept of justice that served the state's interest in maintaining a stable workforce and population. While we don't have a full list of Sargon's laws, later legal codes from the region, which were likely influenced by his precedents, show a move toward proportional punishment and the use of fines. For instance, rather than an automatic death penalty for theft, a system of fines or restitution might be imposed. This was not necessarily more humane, but it was more practical for an empire. A dead subject cannot pay taxes or serve in the army. A subject who pays a fine or who is forced into labor to repay a debt remains a productive, if punished, member of society. This shift in thinking from vengeance to state-controlled correction is a hallmark of a mature imperial legal system. It reflects the understanding that the population itself is a resource that must be managed wisely. The ultimate goal of Sargon's legal reforms was to prevent the fragmentation of his empire along its countless old fault lines. by providing a mechanism for resolving conflicts between different groups in a way that was seen as legitimate. He reduced the temptation for communities to take justice into their own hands. A legal system that people believe in is a powerful deterrent to rebellion. Why risk everything in a violent uprising if you feel you can get a fair hearing in the king's court? This framework of predictable justice created a powerful incentive for peaceful coexistence and cooperation. It made the idea of being part of the Akkadian Empire tangible and beneficial on a daily basis, far beyond the abstract concept of loyalty to a distant king. Sargon's legacy in law, though less flashy than his military conquests, was arguably just as foundational. He established the crucial principle that for an empire to endure, it cannot be held together by fear alone. It must also be held together by a shared belief in a system of order, a system where the rules are known, the process is reliable, and the outcome, while not always perfect, is accepted as the final word. This blueprint for imperial justice, this early grasp of the rule of law, would be refined over centuries, eventually finding its way into the core of every great empire that understood that true power is not just the ability to command, but the authority to judge. Now, with the legal framework providing stability and the economy humming along, Sargon turned his attention to the literal ground beneath his empire's feet. He understood that power wasn't just about laws and armies. It was about physically shaping the land itself to serve the state's needs and broadcast its glory. This brings us to a cornerstone of his imperial blueprint, the massive state-sponsored investment in infrastructure and public works. Think of an empire not just as lines on a map, but as a living organism. For it to thrive, it needs arteries to carry its lifeblood, which in the ancient world was water, food, and information. Sargon became a master engineer of this imperial body, constructing the veins and sinews that would bind his territories together in a way that conquest alone never could. The most critical of these projects, the absolute foundation of Mesopotamian civilization, was water. The Fertile Crescent was not naturally fertile everywhere. It was a land of brutal summers and unpredictable rivers. Sargon's administration undertook what can only be described as a hydraulic revolution. They didn't just dig a few ditches, they engineered a vast, interconnected network of canals that stretched for miles, systematically diverting water from the Tigris and Euphrates to fields that had previously been too arid to farm. The scale of this effort was staggering. It required advanced surveying skills to ensure the canals had the precise, gentle slope needed for water to flow steadily without eroding the channels. It required thousands of laborers organized into work gangs by the state, who dug with copper and bronze tools and moved earth with baskets. This was not a seasonal community project. It was a permanent, state-managed enterprise. The result was a dramatic increase in agricultural productivity. Land that once yielded a meager harvest could now produce bumper crops of barley and wheat. This created the massive food surplus that was the non-negotiable prerequisite for everything else in the empire. It fed the standing army, it sustained the growing urban populations in cities like Akkad, and it provided a buffer against drought and famine. A well-fed population is a less rebellious one, and Sargon's canals were a powerful argument for the benefits of imperial rule delivered directly to the farmer's field. But these waterworks were more than just agricultural tools. They were instruments of control. By controlling the water, the central government held the ultimate leverage over provincial governors and local communities. A governor contemplating rebellion would have to consider that the life-giving water for his entire region flowed through canals maintained by the king's engineers. The state could, in theory, redirect water away from a rebellious area, effectively starving it into submission without ever drawing a sword. This quiet, infrastructural power was as potent as any military garrison. One of the most famous examples was the work done along the Euphrates. Inscriptions and later records speak of Sargon's efforts to make the wastelands bear grain by constructing new canals and clearing silt from old ones. He effectively re-engineered the landscape, turning previously marginal territories into valuable, tax-producing agricultural zones. This had a double benefit. It increased the empire's overall wealth, and it allowed for the settlement of loyal populations, often veterans from his armies, on these new lands, creating a patchwork of dependable communities in strategic locations. Alongside this hydraulic network, Sargon invested in building and maintaining roads. These weren't the paved stone highways of the later Romans, but carefully maintained dirt tracks that were cleared of obstacles and marked for travelers. The innovation wasn't in the road surface itself, but in the system behind it. These were official royal roads, designed for the rapid movement of messengers, military units, and trade caravans. A messenger carrying clay tablets with urgent orders from the capital could travel much faster on a road that was known to be safe, well marked, and equipped with way stations for rest and supplies. This dramatically sped up imperial communication, shrinking the effective size of the empire and allowing Sargon to react to news from the provinces with unprecedented speed. For the military, it meant that armies could march further and faster, arriving with their strength intact rather than exhausted from a difficult journey. For the economy, these secure roads lowered the cost of transportation, making it cheaper to move goods from regions of production to regions of consumption, which further integrated the empire's economies. The labor required for these colossal projects was immense, and how Sargon mobilized it is itself a fascinating aspect of his rule. He used a combination of conscripted labor from the general population, which was likely a form of tax obligation, and specialized, state-employed engineers and overseers. During the agricultural off-season, farmers would be drafted into work gangs to maintain and dig canals or work on road construction. This was a clever use of idle manpower that also fostered a sense of collective participation in the empire's greatness. People who had literally poured their sweat into building a canal felt a sense of ownership and pride in it. They could see the direct connection between their labor and the prosperity of their own community. This transformed infrastructure from a top-down imposition into a shared communal achievement, brilliantly blurring the lines between forced labor and civic duty. The psychological impact of these public works cannot be overstated. When a subject saw a massive, perfectly straight canal bringing water to their fields, or traveled on a well-maintained road patrolled by imperial soldiers, they received a constant, tangible reminder of the empire's power, organizational skill, and crucially, its benevolence. The message was clear: the king in Akkad is not just a conqueror who takes your taxes, he is a provider who ensures your food supply and your safety. A temple restored or a new one built with imperial resources was not just a place of worship, it was a monument to the king's piety and his role as the guardian of the god's favor. This built a deeper, more resilient form of loyalty than fear alone could ever achieve. Sargon's infrastructure blueprint taught a powerful lesson to all future empire builders. If you want to truly own a territory, you must improve it. You must leave your mark on the very landscape, creating systems that people depend on for their daily survival and prosperity. From the Qin dynasty's Zhujiangyan irrigation system that still functions today, to the Incan road network that traversed impossible mountain terrain, to the Roman aqueducts that defined urban life, the greatest empires in history have always been master builders. They understood, just as Sargon did, that stone, water, and earth, when shaped by a grand vision, become the most enduring foundations of power. While his armies were a formidable hammer, Sargon understood that not every problem was a nail. Constantly putting down rebellions and fighting on every frontier is a draining, expensive way to run an empire, consuming resources and soldiers at an unsustainable rate. This is where he unveiled his ninth masterstroke, moving beyond pure coercion to master the subtle and often more potent art of diplomacy and alliance building. He realized that a potential enemy turned into a friendly partner was a far greater asset than a smoldering ruin that required a permanent garrison. His approach was a sophisticated blend of soft power and hard power, using the carrot just as effectively as the stick to weave a web of influence that stretched far beyond his direct military control. Think of it as a grand geopolitical chess game where marriage vows, lavish gifts, and shrewd trade deals were the moves that secured his borders and expanded his reach without a single arrow being loosed. One of his most effective tools was the strategic use of marriage alliances. This wasn't about romance, it was high-stakes statecraft. Sargon would marry his sons and daughters into the ruling families of neighboring kingdoms and powerful city-states on his periphery. When his daughter, for instance, became the queen of a neighboring land, it created an unbreakable blood tie. Her children, the heirs to that foreign throne, would be his own grandchildren. This made a military attack on Akkad an attack on their own future king's family. It bound the interests of two states together at the most fundamental, dynastic level. These foreign sons-in-law and brothers-in-law became stakeholders in the Akkadian Empire's success, often acting as a powerful voice for peace and cooperation within their own courts. It was a brilliant long-term investment in stability, turning volatile border regions into peaceful, interdependent neighbors. Alongside these familial bonds, Sargon was a master of diplomatic theater and gift exchange. He maintained a corps of skilled ambassadors, trusted officials who traveled to foreign courts bearing magnificent presents, precious metals, finely crafted weapons, rare textiles, and exotic animals. These weren't just bribes, they were powerful symbols. In the ancient world, the exchange of gifts created a reciprocal obligation. By accepting Sargon's lavish gifts, a foreign ruler was implicitly agreeing to a relationship, one that came with expectations of friendship and favorable terms. These ambassadors were more than just delivermen. They were intelligence gatherers, linguists, and negotiators. They would learn the local language, understand the political factions at court, and identify the king's weaknesses and desires. A skilled ambassador could then negotiate a treaty that felt like a victory for both sides, all while advancing Akkad's strategic interests. He might secure permission for Akkadian merchants to have exclusive trading rights in a key port, or get a promise that the local kingdom would not harbor Akkadian rebels. A fascinating example of this diplomacy in action was his relationship with the powerful kingdom of Elam, located in what is now southwestern Iran. Elam was a formidable civilization in its own right, and a full-scale war with them would have been costly and uncertain. Instead of launching an invasion, Sargon chose engagement. Inscriptions suggest he established a diplomatic dialogue, likely involving gift exchanges and perhaps even a marriage alliance. The result was not outright conquest, but the establishment of Elam as a tributary state or a favored ally. Elamite elites were welcomed into Sargon's administration, and Elamite goods flowed into Mesopotamia. This relationship secured his eastern flank, allowing him to focus his military resources elsewhere. It also gave him access to Elam's vast resources, including timber, stone, and precious metals, without the burden of directly administering a hostile territory. This was the essence of his diplomatic genius, turning a potential rival into a resource. Another key aspect was his handling of these tributary states. They weren't crushed underfoot, they were given a clearly defined and often beneficial place within the Akkadian sphere of influence. A tributary king would agree to pay an annual tribute, usually in the form of goods unique to his region, perhaps horses, timber, or gemstones. In return, he received something immensely valuable: security. His kingdom was under the protection of the Akkadian army. He gained access to the vast, protected trade networks of the empire, which could make his own realm far wealthier than the tribute he paid. And he was often left to manage his own internal affairs with little interference. This system was far more efficient than direct rule. It allowed Sargon to project power and extract wealth from a region without the administrative headache and military cost of governing it directly. The local population, still ruled by their own king and traditions, was less likely to rebel, and the Akkadian Empire enjoyed the benefits of their resources and strategic compliance. This intricate dance of diplomacy created a network of loyal vassals and allies that acted as a buffer zone around the empire's core. An invading army from the north wouldn't first hit Akkadian territory. It would have to fight through kingdoms that were bound to Sargon by treaty, marriage, and mutual interest. These buffer states would sound the alarm and slow down the invader, giving Sargon precious time to muster his professional army for a decisive counter-attack. This defensive depth made the empire incredibly resilient. Sargon's blend of coercion and negotiation set a timeless precedent. It illustrated that true imperial power isn't just about the ability to destroy, but about the wisdom to incorporate. He showed that a treaty could be as strong as a fortress wall, a marriage as binding as a chain of command, and a trade agreement as powerful as a legion. This dual-track strategy of force and persuasion, of making friends as well as defeating enemies, became a cornerstone of statecraft for every great empire that followed, from the Byzantine diplomats who played tribes against each other on their frontiers to the Roman practice of granting citizenship to loyal allies. Sargon proved that the most successful conquerors are often the ones who know when to lay down their swords and extend a hand. Even the most brilliantly constructed empire is ultimately a fragile thing, a complex machine that can seize up and shatter if the hand at the controls changes in a moment of chaos or conflict. Sargon, having built this unprecedented state from the ground up, faced a problem no ruler before him had ever encountered on such a scale. How do you ensure it all doesn't fall apart the moment you are gone? His answer was to invent the concept of dynastic succession, transforming the empire from a personal possession into a family inheritance. He realized that for an empire to achieve true longevity, it needed to outlive its founder, and that required a clear, unquestioned pathway for power to flow from one generation to the next. This was a radical departure from the older Sumerian model, where a powerful city lord might be succeeded by his son, but there was no guarantee, and certainly no precedent for a single family ruling over a vast multi-ethnic territory. Sargon's vision was to make the name of Sargon synonymous with rulership itself, to create a brand of power so strong that it became the only logical option. He began this process by meticulously grooming his children for leadership, not as a vague hope, but as a core function of the state. His sons, like Rimush and Manishtushu, were not left to their own devices. They were given crucial military and administrative posts from a young age. They led armies on campaigns, governed important provinces, and sat in on councils of state. This was a hands-on apprenticeship. They learned the art of war not from a textbook, but by commanding troops in the field. They learned governance not through theory, but by managing the taxes, legal disputes, and infrastructure projects of a real, functioning region. This practical education served two vital purposes. First, it equipped them with the actual skills needed to rule, ensuring they weren't just figureheads who would be easily manipulated by powerful generals or scheming priests. Second, and just as importantly, it allowed them to build their own power bases and reputations while their father was still alive and could guide them. A general who had fought alongside Prince Rimush would be far more likely to accept him as king than a prince who had spent his life isolated within palace walls. This system of on-the-job training for heirs became a model for millennia, from the Roman practice of appointing a co-emperor to the medieval tradition of granting princelings their own duchies to govern. But Sargon's dynastic planning was remarkably forward-thinking in another way. It included his daughters. He didn't see them merely as pawns for marriage alliances, though they served that vital diplomatic function as well. He gave them roles of genuine power and influence, most famously his daughter Enheduanna, whom he installed as the high priestess of the moon god Nanna in the sacred Sumerian city of This was a masterstroke of political and religious strategy. By placing his own daughter at the head of the most important religious institution in Sumer, he fused his bloodline with the very spiritual authority of the land. Enheduanna wasn't just a priestess, she was a poet, a politician, and a propagandist. Her hymns, which survive to this day, explicitly link her father's and brother's rule to the divine will of the gods, providing a theological justification for the entire Akkadian dynasty. She became a living symbol of the union between Akkad and Sumer, and her position was so powerful that she held it through the reigns of both of her brothers, becoming a constant, stabilizing force and a direct representative of the royal family's enduring divine right to rule. This use of the entire family as a ruling unit, with each member playing a designated role in propping up the structure, was a key innovation in creating a sense of dynastic permanence. To further cement this idea, Sargon and his successors heavily promoted the use of religious sanction. They didn't just claim to rule because they were Sargon's sons. They claimed that the gods themselves had ordained their family to rule for all time. Inscriptions began to refer not just to Sargon as the chosen of Ishtar, but to his entire lineage. This created a powerful narrative of inevitability. Challenging the rule of Naram-Sin wasn't just challenging a man, it was challenging the cosmic order, defying the gods who had placed his family on the throne. This ideological framework made rebellion not just treason, but sacrilege, a potent deterrent in a deeply religious society. However, this brilliant system was not without its inherent and profound vulnerabilities, and the reigns of Sargon's immediate successors laid them bare for all to see. When Sargon finally died after a reign of over half a century, the empire did not transition peacefully. His son Rimush faced immediate and massive revolts across Sumer. It seems that while the subjects would tolerate the overwhelming force and charisma of Sargon the Great, they were far less willing to accept the same from his son. Rimush spent his entire, relatively short reign brutally putting down these rebellions, campaign after bloody campaign, in a clear demonstration that the system was still fragile, that the idea of a hereditary empire was not yet fully ingrained. The violence of his reign suggests that the blueprint for succession, while visionary, was not yet foolproof. Then came his grandson, Naram-Sin, who took the concept of dynastic rule to its logical and perhaps most audacious conclusion. Naram-Sin was one of the most powerful Akkadian emperors, a successful warrior and a grand builder. So confident was he in the permanence of his dynasty that he took an unprecedented step. He declared himself a living god. Inscriptions and his famous victory stele depict him wearing the horned crown of divinity, a privilege previously reserved only for deities. This was the ultimate expression of the dynastic principle. He was no longer just a king who ruled by the grace of the gods. He was a god-king, the culmination of his grandfather's bloodline. This deification was a powerful tool for centralizing authority and intimidating rivals, but it also created a dangerous precedent. It raised the stakes impossibly high. If a god king were to be defeated or humiliated, what would that say about the gods who allowed it? Later Mesopotamian literature, like the Curse of Akkad, would portray Naram-Sin's reign as one of hubris that led to the empire's eventual downfall, showing how the very tools used to build dynastic stability could, when pushed too far, contribute to its collapse. The great lesson of Sargon's succession plan is that it is a double-edged sword. By creating a clear hereditary line, he provided the continuity and predictability that large-scale governance desperately needs. It prevented the free-for-all power struggles that could have destroyed his life's work overnight. It created an institution, the dynasty, that was bigger than any single individual. Yet, it also tied the empire's fate to the capabilities and fortunes of a single family, introducing the risks of incompetent heirs, fratricidal conflict, and the kind of theological overreach that could alienate the very populations the empire relied upon. Sargon's blueprint showed every future emperor, from the Caesars of Rome to the great Khans of Mongolia, that building an empire is only half the battle. You must also build a family strong enough and a story compelling enough to convince the world that your children have every right to inherit the earth. Of course, the most effective form of control is the kind that people willingly impose upon themselves, a belief system so deeply ingrained that to challenge it feels like a transgression against the natural order. This is the profound power of religion, and Sargon of Akkad was its undisputed master architect in the realm of statecraft. He recognized that while armies could conquer land and bureaucracies could administer it, only faith could conquer the human spirit and secure its lasting allegiance. His approach was not the blunt force of religious imposition, but something far more sophisticated and enduring. A deliberate, strategic fusion of faith and political power that transformed his rule from a matter of earthly power into a divine mandate. At the heart of this policy was a brilliant act of theological syncretism. The Sumerian city-states he had conquered possessed a deeply complex and ancient pantheon, with gods like Enlil, the king of the gods residing in Nippur, and Inanna, the powerful goddess of love and war, central to their cosmic understanding. For Sargon, an Akkadian outsider, to dismiss these deities would have been catastrophic, instantly branding him a sacrilegious tyrant. Instead, he performed a masterful integration. He claimed that it was the Sumerian goddess Inanna herself who had chosen him, forsaking her own people's kings to champion his cause. This was a breathtaking psychological maneuver. It told the defeated Sumerians that their defeat was not a military failure but a divine judgment, and that their own most revered goddess had actively willed the rise of this new Akkadian order. He didn't stop there. He systematically merged the Akkadian and Sumerian pantheons, creating a unified imperial religion. The Akkadian Ishtar became synonymous with the Sumerian Inanna. The Akkadian Enlil was equated with the Sumerian Elil. This meant a priest in the city of could continue his rituals to the moon god Nanna, while a priest in Akkad worshipped the moon god Sin, and they were, for all political and practical purposes, worshipping the same god who now blessed Sargon's empire. This created a shared spiritual framework that transcended old ethnic and city-state loyalties, weaving a common theological fabric across the entire realm. To physically embody and administer this new state religion, Sargon embarked on an ambitious program of temple construction and priestly appointment. He didn't just build temples, he built temples dedicated to a new concept, imperial glory. These structures were not merely places of worship, they were monuments to the power of the Akkadian state and the divine favor it enjoyed. Their grandeur, funded by imperial wealth, served as a constant, visible reminder of the king's piety and his unique relationship with the gods. More importantly, Sargon ensured that the priestly classes, the interpreters of the divine will, were loyal to him. He appointed his own supporters to key religious posts, turning the priesthood from an independent power base into an arm of the state. These loyal priests would then disseminate the official narrative from their pulpits and during public festivals, telling the populace that prosperity and divine favor were directly tied to their loyalty to Sargon. The gods themselves, they preached, demanded obedience to the king of Akkad. The most potent example of this strategy was the appointment of his daughter, Enheduanna, as the high priestess of the moon god Nanna in the supremely important Sumerian city of This was a move of pure genius. Was one of the holiest sites in Mesopotamia, the religious heart of Sumerian culture. By placing his own daughter at the head of its most important temple, Sargon was not just installing a family member, he was fusing his bloodline with the most sacred traditions of the people he had conquered. Enheduanna was no mere figurehead. She was a towering intellectual and literary figure, the first author in history known to us by name. She used her immense religious authority to compose hymns and poems that explicitly wove her father's and brother's rule into the very fabric of Sumerian cosmology. In her famous hymn to Inanna, she declares that it is the goddess who has appointed the king, giving him the scepter to shepherd the land. Through her voice, the sacred poetry of Sumer itself was co-opted to serve the ideology of the Akkadian Empire, providing an unassailable theological justification for its existence. The propaganda value of this religious policy was immense and is vividly preserved in surviving royal inscriptions. These texts, carved on stone steels and clay cylinders, are filled with language that goes far beyond bragging about military victories. They portray Sargon as a pious servant, a divinely guided ruler whose every action is blessed by the gods. One inscription doesn't just say he conquered a city, it states that the god Dagon gave him the upper land, including the cities of Mari and Ebla. This framing transforms naked aggression into a holy crusade, a fulfillment of a celestial plan. For the average farmer or merchant, this created a powerful aura of inevitability and legitimacy around Sargon's rule. To oppose him was not just politically unwise, it was spiritually dangerous, a rebellion against the gods themselves. This blueprint of divine sanction became one of the most enduring and widely copied tools in the imperial toolkit. We see its direct descendant in the Roman imperial cult, where emperors were deified after death and later worshipped as gods during their lives, serving as a focal point for loyalty across a vast, diverse empire. We see it in the Byzantine emperor's role as the viceroy of God on earth, and in the Chinese mandate of heaven, where the right to rule was granted by celestial forces and could be withdrawn in the face of poor governance. Sargon demonstrated that the most resilient throne is built not only on a foundation of stone and soldiers, but within the temples and the souls of the people. By bridging the earthly and the celestial, he forged a chain of authority that was far stronger than iron, one that bound the conscience of his subjects to the destiny of his empire. But a network of canals and roads, no matter how well built, needs destinations. It needs central points where all these flows of water, goods, and information can converge, be processed, and be redirected with purpose. Sargon understood that to truly weave his disparate territories into a single, cohesive fabric, he needed to create a new kind of human landscape. He needed to move populations from scattered villages and integrate them into a system of strategically placed, fortified urban centers. This was the birth of state-sponsored urbanization as a deliberate tool of imperial policy. Before Sargon, cities in Mesopotamia were primarily independent city-states, often at odds with one another. His vision was to transform them from isolated rivals into interconnected nodes within a grand imperial network. He didn't just conquer cities, he actively founded new ones and dramatically expanded existing ones, turning them into specialized instruments of control, production, and cultural assimilation. Imagine the empire as a living body. The capital, Akkad, was the beating heart, but these provincial cities were the vital organs. The lungs, the liver, the kidneys, each performing a crucial function to keep the entire system alive and healthy. Their placement was never accidental. Sargon and his planners chose locations with meticulous care, always with an eye toward strategic advantage. A new city might be founded at the confluence of two major rivers, becoming a natural hub for inland waterway trade. Another might be built at the mouth of a mountain pass, controlling access to valuable mineral resources and serving as a fortified bulwark against incursions from the highlands. Yet another would be established in the middle of a vast agricultural plain, acting as a central collection point for grain taxes and a distribution center for goods heading to the capital. This systematic approach to urban planning created a web of interdependence. A city in the northern highlands might specialize in metalworking, using local copper and tin to produce bronze tools and weapons. Those goods would then be shipped down river to a city in the agricultural heartland, which would pay for them with surplus grain. That grain, in turn, would be sent to a garrison city on a volatile frontier to feed the professional soldiers stationed there. Each city had a role to play, and its prosperity became tied to its successful function within the imperial whole, not its isolated independence. The physical design of these cities reflected their new purpose. Archaeologists studying sites that flourished under Akkadian rule, like Tel Brak in modern Syria, have found evidence of a distinct imperial imprint. The most prominent feature was always the fortification. Massive, sloping walls of mud brick, often reinforced with stone foundations and punctuated by heavily guarded gates, surrounded these urban centers. These walls were not just for defense against external enemies, they were a powerful psychological symbol of imperial strength and permanence. They communicated to everyone, inside and out, that this was a place of order, protected by the distant but ever-present power of the king in Akkad. Within these walls, the layout was organized for both efficiency and control. A central citadel or acropolis, elevated and heavily fortified, would house the governor's palace, the main temples, and the central administrative buildings. From this high ground, the imperial governor could look out over the entire city, a physical manifestation of top-down authority. Radiating out from this center were carefully planned districts. There would be a dedicated market area with standardized weights and measures overseen by royal officials, ensuring fair trade and allowing for the easy collection of commercial taxes. There were residential quarters, often segregated by profession or ethnic origin, but all living under the same overarching system of law and administration. And crucially, there were industrial zones where state-sponsored craftsmen worked. These weren't just random artisans, they were often specialists brought in from other parts of the empire. A city might have workshops for pottery production using distinctive Akkadian styles, or for weaving textiles with patterns that blended Sumerian and Akkadian motifs. This wasn't merely about producing goods, it was about standardizing material culture, creating a visual and tangible imperial identity that people used in their daily lives. One of the most critical functions of these provincial cities was to house permanent military garrisons. This was a cornerstone of Sargon's strategy for holding his empire together. A garrison city on a rebellious frontier wasn't just a military base. It was a self-sustaining community of soldiers, their families, and the support staff needed to maintain them. These soldier settlers were given land to farm, but they remained on permanent active duty, ready to respond to any threat at a moment's notice. Their presence served as a constant deterrent to rebellion and a rapid reaction force for any local disturbances. Furthermore, it created pockets of intensely loyal population in otherwise potentially hostile territory. The children of these soldiers grew up as imperial citizens, their identity forged not by the local region but by their family's service to the Akkadian crown. The city of Susa in Elam provides a fascinating case study of this urbanization policy in action. Before Sargon, Susa was the capital of its own distinct civilization. After his conquest, he didn't destroy it. Instead, he transformed it. He built a massive new fortified citadel and installed his own Akkadian governor. He encouraged, or perhaps compelled, Akkadian administrators, merchants, and soldiers to settle there. Archaeological layers from this period show a dramatic shift. The old Elamite artistic styles begin to blend with Akkadian motifs. The administrative tablets switch to using the Akkadian language and cuneiform script. Susa was no longer just an Elamite city. It became a hybrid, a fully integrated administrative and economic hub that served as the Akkadian Empire's gateway to the Iranian plateau and its vast resources. It was a brilliant act of co-option, turning a former rival capital into a powerful engine of imperial control. Similarly, the ancient city of Nineveh, which would later become the magnificent capital of the Assyrian Empire, saw significant development under Sargon's influence. While it wasn't founded by him, his reign marked a period of major expansion and fortification. He recognized its superb strategic location on the Tigris River and its potential as a northern administrative center. By investing in its infrastructure, its walls, its temples, its water supply, he elevated its status from a regional town to a key node in his imperial network, a legacy that would be built upon for centuries to come. This mass urbanization also had a profound social effect. It accelerated the integration of rural populations. As these new and expanded cities grew, they demanded food, raw materials, and labor. This drew people from the surrounding countryside into the urban economy. A farmer might bring his surplus grain to the city market, where he would encounter merchants from distant lands and be subject to imperial standard weights. A young man from a village might find work as a laborer on a massive city wall or a new temple, earning wages paid in grain or silver from the royal treasury. This exposure to the rhythms, languages, and opportunities of city life began to erode old parochial identities. The city became a melting pot, a place where one could aspire to a life beyond subsistence farming, a life connected to the grand narrative of the empire. The very act of living in a planned, fortified city, drinking from its public wells, trading in its regulated markets, and seeking justice in its royal courts was a daily lesson in what the Akkadian Empire had to offer. Sargon's urban blueprint demonstrated that cities are far more than just collections of people and buildings. They are the ultimate tools of integration and control. By planting these fortified nodes across his empire and connecting them with secure roads and canals, he created a resilient system where power, culture, and commerce could circulate freely. He showed that to rule a vast territory, you must give people centers to gravitate toward, not just borders to fear. This understanding that empire is an urban project would be etched into the landscape for millennia, from the Roman civitates that Latinized Western Europe to the colonial ports that built global commercial networks, all following the foundational logic first laid down by the architects of Akkad. Now, while grand monuments and bustling markets projected an image of unshakable power, Sargon knew that the true stability of his empire often rested in the shadows, in the silent, unseen war of information. He understood that a rebellion crushed on the battlefield was a victory, but a rebellion prevented before it could even begin was a far greater triumph. This insight led him to pioneer the 13th element of his imperial blueprint, the creation of a sophisticated intelligence and espionage network. an invisible web of eyes and ears that stretched into every corner of his realm and beyond. In an age without digital surveillance or instant communication, his methods for gathering crucial information were remarkably advanced. He established what we might consider the world's first secret service, a dedicated apparatus of agents whose sole purpose was to watch, to listen, and to report. The primary targets of this network were the very people who held power in his name, his own provincial governors and military commanders. A governor in a distant city, surrounded by local loyalties and commanding a garrison, could easily be tempted to carve out his own little kingdom. To counter this, Sargon embedded informants within their households and administrations. These agents might pose as humble scribes, servants, or even trusted junior officers. Their task was to monitor the governor's correspondence, note his conversations with local elites, and gauge the loyalty of the troops under his command. Any sign of unusual wealth, secret meetings, or discontent with the central authority would be swiftly relayed back to the capital. This system of internal surveillance created a powerful deterrent. A governor considering treason would never know if the soldier guarding his door or the scribe recording his edicts was one of the king's agents. This pervasive uncertainty acted as an invisible leash, ensuring that even the most powerful subordinates thought twice before challenging the throne. But Sargon's spies looked outward as well. He maintained a network of agents in the courts of neighboring kingdoms and potential rivals. These operatives were often disguised as merchants, diplomats, or traveling scholars, roles that provided a perfect cover for gathering intelligence. A merchant caravan from Akkad arriving in the court of a foreign king was not just there to trade, it was a mobile intelligence unit. The merchants would note the size and morale of the army, overhear court gossip about political alliances, and assess the kingdom's economic health. This information was priceless. It allowed Sargon to gauge the intentions of his neighbors, anticipate invasions, and identify moments of weakness he could exploit. Diplomacy itself became a tool for espionage. His official ambassadors were trained observers, tasked with sending back detailed reports on everything they witnessed. The organization of this intelligence apparatus was key to its effectiveness. It wasn't a haphazard collection of random informants. It was a structured system with handlers, couriers, and central coordinators in Akkad. Messages were often coded, using ciphers known only to a trusted few to prevent interception. One method likely involved the cuneiform script itself, where the meaning of signs could be shifted or specific signs used to represent entire words in a pre-arranged code. Couriers who traveled the royal roads with the protection of the state carried these coded dispatches in locked containers, ensuring that sensitive information moved quickly and securely across vast distances. The recruitment of local informants was another masterstroke. Sargon's agents would quietly approach disgruntled minor officials, greedy merchants, or individuals with personal grudges in rival states. These locals were offered silver, protection, or political favors in exchange for information. A minor priest in a Sumerian temple resentful of his superior, or a second son in a noble family with no inheritance, could become a valuable asset. This strategy allowed Sargon to see through the eyes of the people themselves, giving him an intimate understanding of the mood on the ground, the popularity of his policies, and the simmering grievances that could ignite into open revolt. The consequences for those caught plotting against him were severe and deliberately public, designed to serve as a grim warning. Historical inscriptions, while often boasting of his mercy, also make it clear that rebellion was met with brutal force. Conspirators and rebellious governors were not just executed, they were often subjected to horrific, symbolic punishments, impalement, flaying, or being paraded in cages. Their cities might have their walls torn down and their populations deported to other parts of the empire. This ruthless response was not mere sadism, it was a calculated act of psychological warfare. The message was clear and terrifying: the king sees all, and the price of disloyalty is utter annihilation. This policy of overwhelming, exemplary punishment crushed not only the current rebellion, but also the will of anyone else contemplating a similar path for a generation. A powerful example of this system in action can be seen in the way Sargon handled the inevitable revolts that flared up after his initial conquests. The historical records suggest that he was repeatedly able to move against rebellious cities with stunning speed and precision, often arriving with his army before the rebellion had fully consolidated its forces or secured its alliances. This was not luck, it was the direct result of his intelligence network providing him with early warning. His spies within the rebellious city would have sent word at the first sign of conspiracy, allowing him to mobilize his professional army and march to the scene while the rebels were still disorganized and vulnerable. This ability to preempt challenges, to fight the war in the minds of his enemies before it ever reached the battlefield, was perhaps the ultimate expression of his strategic genius. Sargon's legacy in the shadowy realm of espionage is profound. He established the foundational principle that knowledge is the ultimate form of power, and that no ruler can afford to be blind or deaf. His model of a centralized intelligence agency, using a mix of internal surveillance, foreign agents, and coded communication, became the prototype for every secret service that followed. The Roman Empire's frumentarii initially supply officers who evolved into imperial couriers and spies, and later the agents in rebues, were direct descendants of this idea. The elaborate spy networks of the Byzantine Empire, the Ottoman Empire's intricate system of informants, and even the intelligence agencies of the modern world all operate on the core principle that Sargon so clearly demonstrated. To rule effectively, you must first know, and to know, you must have eyes everywhere. He proved that the most secure throne is one surrounded by an invisible wall of vigilant, silent watchers. While the grand canals and fortified walls were the most visible signs of Akkadian power, the true, life-sustaining engine of the empire was humming away in the fields and workshops, driven by a quiet revolution in technology and agriculture. Sargon grasped a fundamental truth that every successful empire would later discover: you cannot feed ambition on an empty stomach. The professional armies, the vast bureaucracies, the growing urban populations, they all demanded a colossal and reliable surplus of food and resources. To meet this unprecedented demand, Sargon didn't just exploit what already existed. He actively engineered a new reality through state-sponsored innovation, systematically pushing the boundaries of what was possible in farming, metallurgy, and transportation. This wasn't a matter of chance discoveries, it was a deliberate policy of research, development, and dissemination, turning the entire empire into a laboratory for progress. The most critical frontier was agriculture. The Mesopotamian landscape was a place of brutal, paradox-fertile soil nourished by two great rivers, yet constantly threatened by scorching sun, unpredictable floods, and salty, mineral-laden water that could poison the land if not managed perfectly. Sargon's administration tackled this with the same organizational zeal they applied to military campaigns. They didn't just dig canals, they engineered a hydraulic society. Building on earlier Sumerian knowledge, Akkadian engineers designed and constructed massive primary canals that tapped into the Tigris and Euphrates, but then they added a new layer of sophistication, an extensive network of secondary and tertiary channels that distributed water with far greater precision to individual fields. This required advanced surveying skills to maintain the exact, gentle gradient needed for a steady flow. They developed improved sluice gates and water-lifting devices like the shaduf, a counterweighted lever that allowed a single farmer to lift water from a canal and pour it into a higher field. This seemingly simple tool was a game-changer, enabling the irrigation of land that was previously beyond the reach of the canals and dramatically increasing the total acreage under cultivation. But the most transformative innovation might have been the widespread adoption of the seed plow. Before this, farming was a two-step process. A farmer would first use a simple a pointed stick to scratch furrows in the earth. Then he would walk behind, manually dropping seeds into the furrows, a method that was slow, wasteful, and resulted in uneven planting. The seed plow combined these actions. It was a larger, heavier plow, often pulled by oxen, that featured a funnel attached to the back. As the plow cut the furrow, seeds would trickle down from this funnel directly into the freshly turned soil, buried at a consistent depth and spacing. The impact of this single invention is almost impossible to overstate. It revolutionized the very efficiency of farming. One farmer with a team of oxen and a seed plow could plant a field in a fraction of the time it used to take, and with a much higher yield per seed. This meant that fewer people could produce vastly more food, freeing up a massive segment of the population to become soldiers, scribes, artisans, and merchants, the very professions that formed the backbone of the imperial state. This was the essential shift from subsistence to surplus, and it was engineered by technology. This agricultural revolution was mirrored by equally significant advances in metallurgy. The Akkadian period saw the full flowering of the Bronze Age. Under Sargon's reign, the production of bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was systematized and scaled up to an industrial level. This was not a casual craft, it was a state-directed enterprise. The empire's reach gave it control over the sources of these critical metals, copper from the mines of Anatolia and the Iranian plateau, and the even more precious tin, likely traded from as far away as Afghanistan. Akkadian metallurgists perfected the recipes and casting techniques to produce bronze that was harder, more durable, and held a sharper edge than pure copper. The output of their workshops was staggering and purposeful. They mass-produced standardized bronze spearheads and arrowheads for the army, giving Akkadian soldiers a decisive technological edge over enemies who might still be using stone or copper weapons. They produced stronger bronze picks and shovels for the workers building canals and fortifications, and they made more durable bronze sickles and plowshares for the farmers, which lasted longer and cut more efficiently, further boosting agricultural productivity. This was a virtuous cycle. Better tools made more food, which supported a larger army, which secured more resources, which allowed for the production of even better tools. The state's role in this technological ecosystem was absolutely central. Sargon effectively established the world's first large-scale research and development programs. He sponsored teams of skilled artisans, the engineers, metallurgists, and cartwrights of their day, giving them the resources and the mandate to improve upon existing designs. These master craftsmen were often gathered in royal workshops in the capital and major provincial cities, where they could share knowledge and standardize their techniques. Their innovations were then propagated throughout the empire. A new, more efficient plow design developed in a workshop near Akkad would be replicated by carpenters in cities across Mesopotamia, creating a uniformity of technology that paralleled the uniformity of law and administration. The state also invested in the training of this skilled workforce, ensuring that the knowledge of how to build a wheel, cast a bronze axe, or survey a canal was not lost but was instead passed down and refined through generations of apprentices. This commitment to technological dissemination had a profound impact on trade and transportation. The Akkadian improvement and standardization of the wheel and axle were particularly momentous. They developed sturdier, solid wooden wheels, often reinforced with bronze rims, and mounted them on carts with more robust axles. These were not the crude, slow-moving travois of the past. These were efficient freight vehicles. Coupled with the expanding network of royal roads, these improved carts could move goods in volumes and at speeds previously unimaginable. A single cart pulled by oxen could carry the equivalent of what would have required a dozen donkeys and their handlers. This dramatically lowered the cost of moving grain from the countryside to the urban granaries, or transporting timber from the mountains to the shipyards on the rivers. It made the long-distance trade in metals, stone, and luxury goods not just possible, but profitable on a massive scale. The entire economy became more fluid and interconnected, with technology acting as the great lubricant. The legacy of Sargon's technological policy is etched into the history of every great empire that followed. The Romans, with their standardized weapons, their concrete, and their vast road network, were following the same blueprint. The Qin dynasty in China, which unified weights, measures, and even the axle lengths of carts to create a seamless imperial infrastructure, was applying the same logic. Sargon demonstrated that an empire's might is not measured only by the size of its army, but by the sophistication of its plows, the strength of its bronze, and the efficiency of its carts. He proved that the most enduring conquests are often those won not on the battlefield, but in the field and the workshop, where human ingenuity is harnessed to master the physical world and build the foundation for everything else. Picture the world's first empire, a colossal land power stretching from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. It's easy to imagine its strength rooted solely in vast armies marching across dusty plains. But Sargon's vision extended far beyond the horizon of dry land. He looked upon the winding arteries of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers and saw something his predecessors had only partially grasped: highways. In a realm where overland travel was slow and arduous, these waterways offered a swift, efficient superhighway for moving everything from grain and timber to entire regiments of soldiers. While we don't think of ancient Mesopotamia as a seafaring culture in the way we do the later Phoenicians or Greeks, Sargon's innovative use of naval power, even in its fledgling riverine and coastal form, became a crucial and often overlooked element of his imperial blueprint. He understood that to truly bind his territories together, he needed to command not just the earth, but the water that flowed through it. His administration undertook the systematic construction of a fleet, not of massive ocean-going galleys, but of sturdy, capacious riverboats and robust coastal vessels capable of navigating the treacherous currents of the great rivers and the shallow waters of the Persian Gulf. This was not a casual side project. It was a deliberate military and economic investment. The primary role of this fleet was to secure the empire's vital logistical lifelines. Before Sargon, control of the rivers was contested, with local chieftains or rival city-states potentially harassing merchant traffic, imposing arbitrary tolls, or cutting off supplies. Sargon's navy changed this dynamic completely. He established patrols along the major waterways, ensuring that the barges carrying grain from the northern farmlands to the granaries of Akkad, or the boats transporting cedar wood from the mountains down to the plains, could travel without fear of piracy or interference. This guarantee of safe passage was a powerful economic stimulus. Merchants could plan larger shipments with confidence, knowing their valuable cargo would reach its destination. This security dramatically lowered the cost and risk of long-distance trade within the empire, further integrating the economies of disparate regions and fueling the prosperity that funded everything else. The strategic advantage for military movement was even more profound. An army marching from Akkad to the distant city of Susa would take weeks, arriving exhausted and consuming much of the supplies it carried along the way. But a regiment of Sargon's professional soldiers could be loaded onto a fleet of boats and transported down the Tigris, covering the same distance in a fraction of the time. They would arrive fresh, well-supplied, and ready for immediate combat. This ability to project power rapidly along internal lines of communication was a revolutionary force multiplier. It meant that a rebellion in a distant province could be met not by a slow, grinding march, but by a sudden, overwhelming appearance of Imperial troops seemingly out of nowhere. This speed and surprise were key to Sargon's famous ability to crush revolts before they could gain momentum or find outside allies. His naval ambition, however, did not stop at the riverbanks. Inscriptions and archaeological evidence point to Sargon extending his reach into the Persian Gulf itself. This was a bold move into a new and challenging environment. The Gulf was a world of its own, with its own cultures like Dilmun, modern Bahrain, and Magan, likely Oman, and its own dangers from sudden storms to skilled, independent maritime peoples. Sargon's campaigns in this region were not mere raids. They were calculated efforts to control the mouth of the Euphrates and the lucrative sea lanes that connected Mesopotamia to the sources of incredibly valuable commodities. From Magan came copper, an essential metal for tools and weapons, and diorite, a beautiful and hard stone used for royal statues. From Dilmun and even farther afield came gold, ivory, and carnelian. By projecting naval power into the Gulf, Sargon aimed to bring this entire trading network under his influence, either through direct control or through coercive diplomacy backed by the threat of his ships. To support this maritime expansion, his administration initiated the construction of the empire's first dedicated ports and harbors. These were not simple river landings, they were engineered facilities. At sites like which was then situated near the coast, Akkadian engineers oversaw the construction of reinforced quays, dredged channels to allow for deeper draft vessels, and protected basins where ships could be loaded and unloaded safely, regardless of the weather. These ports became bustling hubs of imperial activity. Here, goods from across the empire were consolidated for export, and exotic imports from across the sea were received, taxed, and distributed inland. They were also vital naval bases where Sargon's fleet could be repaired, resupplied, and stationed for rapid deployment. The development of these ports required a deep integration with the local riverine and coastal cultures. Sargon's shipwrights and sailors did not invent their craft in a vacuum. They learned from and incorporated the knowledge of people who had lived and worked on these waters for generations. These local populations understood the complex currents of the rivers, the seasonal winds of the Gulf, and the best methods for constructing boats from the available reeds and woods. By bringing these skilled boatmen and navigators into the imperial fold, either through employment or alliance, Sargon gained access to a vast reservoir of practical maritime knowledge. This cultural and technological synthesis was typical of his broader strategy. He didn't simply impose his ways, he absorbed and systematized the best practices from every corner of his realm, making them tools of the state. This foray into naval power also necessitated the development of early amphibious tactics. While records are sparse, it is clear that Sargon's forces were capable of launching coordinated assaults from the water. Imagine the psychological impact on a rebellious city situated on a riverbank, seeing not just an army approaching from land, but a fleet of Akkadian boats simultaneously landing troops at their weakly defended waterfront, effectively surrounding them. This combined arms approach, using the rivers as avenues for flanking maneuvers and surprise attacks, gave Sargon a tactical versatility that his landlocked opponents could not match. It allowed him to attack enemy cities from their most vulnerable angles, often where their defenses were the weakest. The legacy of Sargon's maritime initiatives is profound, even if his empire was not a thalassocracy in the classical sense. He demonstrated a fundamental principle that every subsequent empire with any coastline or major river would eventually learn: control of the waterways is a prerequisite for true dominance. The Phoenicians, who built a trading empire based on their mastery of the sea, and the Greeks, whose triremes defined naval warfare, were walking a path that Sargon had first illuminated. Even the Romans, whose power was built by their legions, knew that their empire was held together as much by their control of the Mediterranean, which they called Mare Nostrum or our sea, as by their roads. Sargon's blueprint showed that an empire's reach is not defined by how far its soldiers can walk, but by how effectively it can navigate the natural highways of the world, turning rivers and seas from barriers into the very bonds of unity. Now let's turn our attention to a weapon that doesn't draw blood, but can conquer the human spirit just as effectively: the power of art and symbolism. In a world without mass media or digital screens, the visual landscape was the primary canvas for a ruler's message, and Sargon of Akkad was its undisputed master. He recognized that to truly rule, you must control not just what people do, but what they see, what they feel, and what they believe. His reign saw the transformation of artistic expression from a local, religious craft into a sophisticated, centralized tool of state propaganda. Every sculpture, every carved seal, every public monument was meticulously designed to broadcast a single, unifying narrative. The Akkadian Empire under Sargon was powerful, prosperous, and divinely ordained. This was not art for art's sake, it was art for power's sake, a deliberate and calculated effort to shape the identity of an entire civilization. The artistic style that emerged under his patronage was revolutionary. Before Sargon, Sumerian art often focused on pious worshippers or mythological scenes with a certain static, formal quality. Akkadian art burst onto the scene with a new sense of dynamism and raw political energy. The human form became more naturalistic and powerful, often depicted in moments of action and triumph. The focus shifted from communal religious devotion to the celebration of the king himself, his military victories, his connection to the gods, his role as the guarantor of order and abundance. This new imperial style was intentionally distinct, a visual break from the past that signaled the dawn of a new age. One of the most powerful tools in this visual arsenal was the use of specific, recurring motifs that carried deep symbolic meaning. The lion, for example, became a potent symbol of royal power and ferocity. Depicted in sculptures and on cylinder seals, the lion, often shown being subdued by the king, represented the chaotic forces of nature and rebellion being brought to heel by the strength and courage of the emperor. Then there was the star, representing the divine planet of the goddess Ishtar, with whom Sargon claimed a special relationship. By consistently pairing his image with the star of Ishtar, he visually reinforced the story that he was her chosen champion, that his authority came not just from the battlefield but from the heavens themselves. These symbols acted as a kind of visual shorthand, instantly communicating complex ideological messages to a largely illiterate population. A farmer seeing the star on a royal inscription, or a merchant seeing a lion on a seal marking a shipment of goods, would unconsciously absorb the message of divine kingship and imperial strength. The production of this propaganda was managed by a dedicated class of court artists, the ancient world's equivalent of a ministry of information. These were not free-spirited creators. They were skilled artisans employed directly by the state, working in royal workshops to produce art according to a strict official style. They were the technicians of legitimacy, trained to reproduce the approved motifs and compositions that glorified the ruler. Their work was then distributed strategically across the empire. Impressive stone steles depicting Sargon's victories were erected in city squares where they would be seen by all. Smaller but equally important were the cylinder seals. These small, carved stone cylinders were rolled over wet clay to leave an impression, functioning as a personal signature or official stamp. Under Sargon, the designs on these seals were standardized to feature imperial symbols and scenes. When local governors and officials used these seals on documents, they were not just authenticating paperwork, they were disseminating Akkadian propaganda with every stamp, spreading the imperial image deep into the bureaucracy and daily life of every province. The ultimate expression of this artistic program, and a masterpiece of ancient propaganda, is the victory stele of Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson. This massive limestone monument commemorates Naram-Sin's victory over the Lulubai, a mountain people. The scene is breathtaking in its audacity. Naram-Sin is depicted not as a man among men, but as a giant, godlike figure marching triumphantly up a mountain. He wears the horned helmet of divinity, a privilege previously reserved only for gods, making a bold statement that the emperor himself is now a divine being. His enemies are shown in chaotic disarray, some falling off the mountain, others pleading for mercy. The composition is a single, upward moving diagonal, drawing the viewer's eye directly to the towering figure of the emperor, who stands under the celestial symbols of the sun and stars. This stele does not simply record a battle, it creates a myth. It tells the viewer that the king is a superhuman force, that his victories are preordained, and that resistance is as futile as fighting against the gods. It is a perfect example of how Sargon's blueprint for using art was refined and amplified by his successors, setting a standard for imperial grandiosity that would inspire the colossal reliefs of Assyrian kings and the idealized statues of Roman emperors for centuries to come. The legacy of this artistic strategy is immense. Sargon proved that culture is not a passive byproduct of empire, but an active ingredient in its creation and maintenance. By crafting a powerful, unified visual language, he gave a diverse population a shared set of symbols to believe in. He demonstrated that the stories you tell in stone and clay can be more enduring than the walls of any fortress, shaping how generations perceive a ruler's legacy long after his armies have turned to dust. But to truly grasp the scale of Sargon's ambition, you have to look beyond the armies and the cities to the very land itself. An empire is a voracious organism, constantly consuming resources to sustain its growth, and Sargon faced a challenge that every great civilization eventually confronts. How do you prevent your own success from devouring the environment that supports you? His answer was to pioneer a system of large-scale environmental management, transforming the Akkadian state into the world's first great steward of nature, not out of ecological idealism, but out of sheer pragmatic necessity. He understood that his professional army needed bronze for their weapons, his growing cities needed timber for their buildings, and his entire population needed a reliable, massive food supply. All of this depended on a delicate balance with the natural world. A single prolonged drought, the exhaustion of a key mine, or the silting up of a vital canal could trigger famine, economic collapse, and the unraveling of all he had built. So he set about mastering his empire's surroundings with the same systematic rigor he applied to its administration, creating a blueprint for resource control that would become essential for any state hoping to endure for generations. The absolute cornerstone of this system was water. In Mesopotamia, water was not just a resource, it was life itself. The great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, were both the source of immense fertility and a potential source of catastrophic destruction through flooding or drought. Earlier Sumerian city-states had built local irrigation networks, but these were often uncoordinated and could lead to conflict between upstream and downstream communities. Sargon's administration took water management to an entirely new imperial level. He didn't just dig canals, he created an integrated, empire-wide hydraulic system. His engineers conducted surveys of entire river basins like the Diola River, a major tributary of the Tigris. They mapped the terrain and calculated gradients to design primary canals that could efficiently divert water over long distances. But the real innovation was in the management. The state established water quotas for different regions and even for different seasons. A royal official, a kind of ancient water commissioner, would be responsible for operating sluice gates and weirs to ensure that water was allocated according to the empire's priorities, not local favoritism. This meant that during a dry season, water could be directed away from a less important region to ensure the survival of the prime agricultural heartlands that fed the capital and the army. This centralized control of water was a form of power as potent as any military garrison. A provincial governor considering rebellion would have to face the chilling reality that the king could, with a single order, literally turn off the water supply to his entire region, crippling its agriculture and forcing submission without a single soldier drawing a sword. This control over water also allowed for ambitious agricultural expansion. Sargon's administration launched projects to reclaim marginal lands, turning semi-arid plains into productive farmland by extending the canal network. This not only increased the empire's total grain output, but also provided land to settle loyal veterans, creating a patchwork of reliable, productive communities in strategic locations. The management of water was inseparable from the protection of fertile land. The state enacted policies to prevent the salinization that plagued Mesopotamian agriculture. When land was over-irrigated in a hot climate, water would evaporate and leave behind mineral salts that would slowly poison the soil, rendering it barren. Akkadian agricultural manuals written on clay tablets show an advanced understanding of this problem. They advised farmers on crop rotation, suggesting periods where fields would be left fallow to recover, and they promoted the cultivation of more salt-tolerant crops like barley. This wasn't just folk wisdom, it was state-sponsored agronomy, a deliberate effort to preserve the long-term productivity of the empire's most vital asset, its soil. Beyond the fields, Sargon's reach extended deep underground to the sources of the metals that gave his age its name, the Bronze Age. His military and economic might depended on a constant, massive supply of copper and tin. To secure this, he didn't just trade for these metals, he sought to directly control their sources. Inscriptions boast of his campaigns to secure the copper mines of Magan, in modern-day Oman, and the silver and tin sources in the Taurus and Zagros mountains. This was more than simple plunder. His administration established a system of resource quotas for these mines. Imperial overseers would be stationed at the sites, tasked with organizing the labor, whether local or conscripted, and ensuring a steady, predictable flow of raw materials back to the imperial heartland. The output was staggering. At a site like Tel Brak in northern Syria, archaeologists have found evidence of large-scale bronze workshops producing standardized weapons and tools, all reliant on this state-controlled supply chain. This direct control provided several key advantages. It insulated the empire from the volatility of international trade. He didn't have to worry about a foreign king suddenly raising the price of tin or cutting off supply during a conflict. It also allowed for quality control, ensuring that the bronze used for army spearheads was of a consistent, high-grade alloy. Furthermore, it gave him a powerful diplomatic tool. he could grant or deny access to these precious metals to neighboring kingdoms, using economic leverage to secure alliances or compel obedience without ever going to war. This systematic exploitation, however, came with environmental costs that we can still trace today. The demand for timber for construction, for smelting metal, and for fuel was immense. The great cedar forests of the Amanus Mountains were heavily logged to provide the massive beams for Sargon's palaces and temples. This large-scale deforestation likely had a tangible impact on local climates and ecosystems, increasing soil erosion and altering rainfall patterns. The Akkadians were likely among the first civilizations to encounter the unintended consequences of their own industrial-scale resource consumption. Yet, there is also evidence that they practiced a form of early sustainability. In some regions, they implemented managed forestry, designating certain wooded areas as protected or regulating the cutting of trees to allow for regrowth. They understood that a resource, once exhausted, was gone forever, and that the empire's long-term survival depended on a balance between extraction and renewal. The ultimate proof of Sargon's environmental mastery lies in the archaeological record of sites like the Diyala River Basin. Before the Akkadian period, this was a region of small, scattered settlements. Under Sargon's centralized management, it was transformed. A network of canals turned it into an agricultural powerhouse, supporting a dense population and becoming a key breadbasket for the empire. Clay tablets from the region detail the meticulous administration of this system, records of water allocations, grain storage, and labor assignments for canal maintenance. This wasn't just local initiative. It was the result of a top-down imperial policy that viewed the entire landscape as a single, manageable unit. By preventing local water conflicts and ensuring a stable food supply, this environmental management directly prevented the famines and social unrest that could tear an empire apart. Sargon's legacy in this realm is profound. He demonstrated that an empire is not an abstract political entity floating above the natural world. It is a physical system that is utterly dependent on the resources it can extract and manage. His blueprint centralized control of water, strategic exploitation of minerals, and a pragmatic, if not always perfect, approach to sustainability became the model for every resource-intensive empire that followed. The Qin dynasty in China would undertake massive irrigation projects to feed its armies. The Romans would build aqueducts to sustain their megacities and relentlessly pursue control of Spanish silver and Cornish tin mines. They all understood the fundamental lesson Sargon had etched into the clay tablets of history. To command nations, you must first command the rivers, the forests, and the mountains, for the true foundation of power is not just held by men, but by the land itself. So, if you want to ensure that your empire doesn't just last for your own lifetime but endures for generations, you have to look beyond the current crop of governors and generals. You have to build the next generation, shaping the minds of those who will one day hold the levers of power. This brings us to a profoundly forward-thinking element of Sargon's blueprint, the institutionalized education and cultivation of a loyal elite. Before Sargon, knowledge and the skills of governance were often passed down within families or small, local priestly circles, creating a patchwork of local loyalties and inconsistent competencies. Sargon saw this as a critical weakness. To run a vast, centralized state, he needed a bureaucracy that was not only skilled but also ideologically unified, a class of administrators who thought alike, spoke the same administrative language, and owed their primary allegiance to the imperial system itself. His solution was to create state-sponsored schools, the world's first formal academies for civil servants, designed to mold the children of nobles, conquered elites, and promising commoners into a single, cohesive ruling class. The heart of this educational system was the scribble school, known as the Adaba in Sumerian, the tablet house, but under Sargon, these institutions were transformed. They were no longer just places to learn how to write. They became factories for imperial ideology. The primary language of instruction was, of course, Akkadian cuneiform, the official script of the empire. Imagine a young man from the recently conquered city of arriving at one of these schools in Akkad. His first and most crucial task would be to master this new language and writing system. This was far more than a practical skill. It was a profound act of cultural reprogramming, as he painstakingly practiced forming the wedge-shaped characters in wet clay. He was internalizing the very medium of imperial power. Every document he would ever read or write, every law, every tax record, every military order for the rest of his life would be in this script. It created an unbreakable cognitive link between literacy and loyalty to the Akkadian state. The curriculum in these academies was meticulously designed to produce capable and reliable officials. It was a rigorous blend of the practical and the ideological. Students spent countless hours copying and memorizing standard administrative formularies, the proper way to record a tax payment, the format for a land deed, the phrasing for a royal decree. They learned mathematics not as an abstract science, but as a tool for calculating interest, allocating rations to laborers, and surveying land for agricultural taxes. They studied law, poring over past legal cases and royal edicts to understand the principles of Akkadian justice that they would one day be tasked with administering. But alongside these practical skills, they were steeped in literature that reinforced the empire's legitimacy. They copied and recited the great royal hymns, like those composed by Sargon's own daughter Enheduanna, which celebrated the Akkadian dynasty as the divinely chosen rulers of the world. They learned the official history, the story of Sargon's miraculous rise and his unstoppable conquests, until it became the foundational narrative of their own worldview. This education was a powerful melding of mind and mission. The role of temples in this educational network was crucial, acting as both campuses and ideological partners. Temples were the traditional centers of learning in Mesopotamia, housing libraries of clay tablets and possessing the authority of religious sanction. Sargon, in his typically syncretic style, didn't dismantle this system, he co-opted it. He ensured that the priests who served as teachers were loyal to the crown, and he infused the curriculum with a theology that supported imperial rule. A student learning in a temple school in the holy city of Nippur would be taught that the god Enlil himself had granted Sargon the kingship of all the lands. This fused religious faith with political duty, making service to the empire a sacred calling. Perhaps the most brilliant aspect of this system was its inclusivity towards the elites of conquered territories. Sargon didn't just educate his own Akkadian nobility. He actively recruited the sons of Sumerian city lords, Elamite princes, and other foreign elites into these schools. This was a strategic masterstroke. By bringing these young men to the capital, he removed them from the parochial influences of their hometowns and immersed them in the sophisticated culture of Akkad. They lived and studied alongside the sons of Akkadian generals and administrators, forming bonds of friendship and camaraderie that would last a lifetime. They were exposed to the grandeur of the imperial court, the efficiency of the bureaucracy, and the sheer power concentrated in the city. When these young elites graduated and returned to their home provinces to take up positions of authority, they were fundamentally changed. They were no longer just local chieftains, they were Akkadian-educated officials. They thought in Akkadian administrative terms. They shared a common educational experience with their counterparts across the empire, and they personally knew the men who held power in the capital. Their loyalty was no longer exclusively to their city of birth. It was to the imperial system that had educated them, elevated them, and given them a stake in a project far larger than themselves. This effectively turned potential seeds of rebellion into pillars of the state. We can see the success of this system in the archaeological record, in the thousands of practice tablets and school exercises found at sites across the empire. These tablets show an astonishing uniformity. A student in Susa, on the far eastern edge of the empire, would be copying the same lexical lists, the same mathematical problems, and the same literary texts as a student in the heartland of Sumer. This standardized education created a shared intellectual framework that allowed for seamless communication and coordination across thousands of miles. An administrator transferred from one end of the empire to the other could immediately understand the reports and records he encountered, because they were all produced by people who had gone through the same rigorous training. This was the glue that held the vast imperial bureaucracy together. The legacy of Sargon's educational blueprint is written across the history of governance. The Chinese imperial examination system, which for centuries selected mandarins based on their mastery of Confucian classics and statecraft, was a direct philosophical descendant, creating a meritocratic, if fiercely competitive, administrative class. The Ottoman Empire's Devshirme system, which conscripted young boys from Christian communities, educated them in Istanbul, and turned them into the empire's most loyal soldiers and administrators. The Janissaries and viziers followed the same logic of creating loyalty through formative education. Even the elite boarding schools and universities of modern nations, which often groom the children of the powerful for roles in government and diplomacy, echo Sargon's foundational insight. He demonstrated that the most durable power is not just seized, it is taught. By investing in the minds of the next generation, by giving them a shared language, a shared skill set, and most importantly, a shared identity rooted in service to the state, an empire can build a ruling class that is not just competent, but genuinely devoted to preserving the system that created them. Yet even the most brilliantly designed empire cannot exist in a state of perfect, unchanging stability. Sooner or later, the blueprints must face the storm, the unexpected drought, the sudden invasion, the internal revolt that threatens to tear everything apart. This is the ultimate test of any great power, and for Sargon, it was a test he faced repeatedly. His genius was not just in building a formidable structure, but in his remarkable capacity for crisis management and his willingness to adapt his own systems when they were put under extreme pressure. He understood that an empire is not a static monument, but a living, breathing entity that must be able to bend without breaking, to change its tactics without losing its core identity. This flexibility became the 19th and perhaps most vital element of his entire blueprint, the shock absorber that allowed his creation to endure for generations against forces that would have shattered a more rigid state. Consider the ever-present threat of famine. In an empire entirely dependent on agriculture, a single failed harvest could trigger mass starvation, economic collapse, and widespread rebellion. Sargon's response was a masterclass in proactive logistics. He didn't just build granaries, he created a dynamic system of grain redistribution. During years of plenty, the state would actively purchase surplus grain from farmers, storing it in a network of massive, fortified silos located in key cities and garrison towns. This served as both an economic stabilizer for farmers and a strategic national reserve. Then, when a province was hit by drought or locusts, the central administration could swing into action. Emergency decrees would be issued, authorizing the release of stored grain from unaffected regions. Royal inspectors and soldiers would oversee its transport along the imperial road and river networks, ensuring it reached the afflicted areas. This wasn't just charity, it was a calculated act of state preservation. By preventing famine, Sargon was preventing the desperation that fuels revolt. A population that saw the king's government actively saving them from starvation was far more likely to remain loyal. This system transformed a potential crisis of legitimacy into a powerful demonstration of the empire's tangible benefits, proving that a strong central authority could provide a safety net that isolated city-states never could. But when persuasion and provision were not enough, Sargon showed he could wield force with surgical precision and shocking speed. The so-called Great Rebellion, which erupted across Sumer after his death, was a massive, coordinated uprising that sought to shatter the Akkadian Empire and restore the old order of independent city-states. Sargon's successors, drawing directly on his crisis playbook, did not respond with a single, clumsy hammer blow. Instead, they used the empire's greatest strengths, intelligence and mobility, to dismantle the rebellion piece by piece. Their network of informants provided crucial early warnings, identifying which cities were the ringleaders and which were merely reluctant participants. This allowed them to prioritize their targets. They would then deploy their professional army not in a broad, slow advance, but in rapid, targeted campaigns, moving swiftly along the royal roads and rivers to strike the heart of the rebellion before it could fully consolidate. They understood the power of psychology in a crisis. After defeating a rebellious city, they would execute the rebel leaders in a public and dramatic fashion, serving as a grim warning to others. But they often showed clemency to the general population, reaffirming imperial law and restoring local administration under tighter oversight. This blend of overwhelming force against the instigators and calculated mercy toward the masses prevented the conflict from escalating into a genocidal war of annihilation. It was a strategy of de-escalation through superior force, designed to re-establish control with maximum efficiency and minimum long-term resentment. This adaptability extended to the very structure of his government in times of emergency. Sargon institutionalized the use of emergency decrees, granting his provincial governors and military commanders temporary, heightened powers to deal with local crises without waiting for orders from the distant capital. A governor facing an imminent invasion from hill tribes could mobilize local militias, commandeer supplies, and fortify positions immediately. This decentralization of crisis response was a brilliant acknowledgement that a vast empire cannot be micromanaged from a single point during an emergency. It empowered local officials to act decisively, trusting that they were operating within the overarching framework of imperial policy. Of course, this trust was balanced by a system of strict accountability once the crisis had passed, ensuring that these emergency powers were not abused to create personal fiefdoms. Communication was the nervous system that made this entire crisis response mechanism function. In an age without radio or telegraph, Sargon relied on his corps of royal messengers, who could travel the empire's protected routes with remarkable speed. During a rebellion or invasion, a constant stream of clay tablet dispatches would flow between the front lines and the capital. These messages contained everything from tactical updates and resource requests to intelligence on enemy movements. This flow of information allowed Sargon and his commanders to make informed decisions, adapt their strategies in real time, and maintain a coordinated response across vast distances. A rebellion in the south could be contained while the main army was freed to deal with an invasion in the north, all because the central command had a clear, if delayed, picture of the entire battlefield. This emphasis on clear, constant communication during upheaval prevented the panic and fragmentation that so often doomed lesser states. The ultimate proof of this system's resilience is simply the fact that the Akkadian Empire survived. It weathered the Great Rebellion, it endured the reigns of multiple successors, and it faced down external threats that would have overwhelmed a less adaptable polity. Sargon's blueprint for crisis management taught a lesson that would be forgotten and relearned by empires throughout history. That survival is not about avoiding challenges, but about developing the capacity to meet them with a full toolbox, a blend of compassionate provision, ruthless force, decentralized initiative, and flawless communication. He demonstrated that the most enduring structures are not the rigid ones, but those designed with flexibility in their very foundations, allowing them to sway with the storms of history rather than stand brittle against them until they inevitably snap. Yet even in a world dominated by the imagery of warrior kings and male gods, Sargon's empire found a profound and unexpected source of strength in the women of the royal family. To view ancient empires as purely patriarchal enterprises where women were secluded and powerless is to miss a crucial strategic dimension. Sargon, ever the pragmatist, understood that power has many faces, and he brilliantly leveraged the soft power and sacred authority of royal women to bind his culturally fractured empire together. The most stunning example of this was his own daughter, Enheduanna. Her story is not a minor footnote, it is a central chapter in the history of statecraft. By appointing her as the high priestess of the moon god Nanna in the Sumerian city of Sargon executed a move of sheer political genius. Was not just any city, it was the religious heart of Sumer, a place of immense spiritual significance. Placing his own flesh and blood at the apex of its most important temple was a powerful, symbolic act of fusion. It told the conquered Sumerians, in a language they could not possibly misunderstand, that the new Akkadian dynasty was not an alien force here to destroy their traditions, but a respectful guardian here to preserve and lead them. Enheduanna was no mere figurehead. She was the first author in all of human history that we know by name, a poet and politician of the highest order. Her surviving hymns, particularly those dedicated to the goddess Inanna, are not just religious texts, they are masterpieces of political propaganda. In her famous work, The Exaltation of Inanna, she does something revolutionary. She explicitly credits the goddess with overthrowing the Sumerian king Lugaltsagesi and granting the kingship to Sargon. She writes, "You have given the king Sargon a place of honor. You have handed Lugaltsagesi over to Sargon." Through her sacred poetry, she was rewriting history itself, framing her father's military conquest as a divine judgment carried out by the Sumerians' own most powerful goddess. This was psychological warfare at its most elegant, using the authority of a Sumerian deity to legitimize Akkadian rule and making resistance seem not just futile but sacrilegious. Her position gave her a platform that no male general or governor could ever possess, allowing her to speak directly to the souls of the people and convince them that their gods were now on the side of Akkad. The education and preparation of royal women like Enheduanna were clearly extensive. To hold such a complex and influential role, she would have needed to be fluent in both the Akkadian and Sumerian languages, deeply versed in the intricate theologies of both cultures, and skilled in the arts of administration and diplomacy. She wasn't just dropped into the role, she was meticulously groomed for it, indicating that Sargon's court invested significant resources in cultivating the talents of its women for high-stakes imperial service. This challenges our modern assumptions about gender roles in the ancient world, revealing a society where royal women could receive an elite education that equipped them for leadership positions of immense spiritual and political weight. Beyond her religious duties, Enheduanna almost certainly played a vital role in the delicate diplomacy of empire. As the high priestess in she would have been a central figure in the social and political life of southern Mesopotamia, hosting visiting dignitaries, mediating between local Sumerian elites and the Akkadian administration, and serving as a living bridge between the two cultures. Her very presence in would have reassured the local population, while her unwavering loyalty to her father ensured that the interests of the imperial center were always represented. This model of using royal women as diplomats and integrators became a recurring theme in later empires. We see it in the Ptolemaic Egypt of Cleopatra and in the Byzantine Empire, where empresses like Theodora wielded immense influence, shaping religious policy and international relations. Sargon's inclusion of women in his governance was not about modern ideals of equality. It was a cold, calculated recognition that to build a resilient empire, you must utilize every tool at your disposal. By empowering his daughter to become the spiritual leader of his conquered foes, he turned a potential point of conflict into a powerful instrument of unity, demonstrating that sometimes the most effective way to conquer a people is not to crush their gods, but to appoint your own high priestess to lead them. Now consider a different kind of weapon, one that stands silent and immovable, yet speaks volumes across the centuries: the weapon of stone and mortar. While spies gathered intelligence and armies marched, Sargon was also waging a war of perception on a colossal scale, using the very landscape itself as his canvas. He understood that to make an empire feel eternal, you must build as if you are building for eternity. This was the birth of monumental architecture as a deliberate tool of statecraft, a physical manifestation of imperial grandeur designed to awe subjects, intimidate rivals, and stamp the identity of Akkad onto the earth so powerfully that no one could ever forget who ruled here. His constructions were not merely buildings, they were proclamations in baked brick and limestone, declaring that a new, unstoppable order had arrived. The centerpiece of this architectural revolution was his capital city, Akkad, and while its exact location remains lost to time, the descriptions that survive paint a picture of a city designed to overwhelm the senses. Earlier Sumerian cities had grown organically over centuries, a tangle of streets and temples reflecting their long, layered histories. Akkad was different. It was a planned city, conceived and executed within a single reign, and its layout was a direct expression of centralized power. At its heart stood the royal palace, a structure that broke decisively from tradition. Sumerian palaces were often integrated into the urban fabric, but Sargon's palace was a fortress within a city, raised on a massive, artificial platform that lifted it high above the surrounding buildings. This elevated platform, or terrace, was a psychological masterstroke. It meant that from anywhere in the city, your eye would be drawn upward to the seat of power, a constant visual reminder of the hierarchy that governed your life. The palace wasn't just tall, it was vast. Texts describe it as a complex of courtyards, throne rooms, administrative offices, and residential quarters that could house the entire imperial bureaucracy and the extended royal family. The walls were not made of the traditional sun-dried mud brick, which eroded quickly under the elements. Sargon's architects pioneered the widespread use of kiln-fired bricks. Baking bricks in a furnace made them incredibly hard, durable, and resistant to water. This was a costly and fuel-intensive process, but it sent an unmistakable message. The Akkadian state had the resources and the technical knowledge to build in a way that was meant to last for ages, a stark contrast to the more perishable structures of the past. These fired bricks were often glazed in vibrant blues and greens, and the walls were decorated with thousands of clay cones painted in different colors and pressed into the wet plaster to create intricate geometric patterns and images of mythical beasts. Imagine the sun glaring off these brilliantly colored, towering walls, a sight designed to inspire a mix of wonder, pride, and fear. The labor force required for such a project was itself a testament to imperial power. This was not the community labor of a local temple project. Sargon mobilized thousands of workers through a system of conscription, a form of tax paid in labor. Teams of unskilled laborers would quarry the stone, dig the clay for bricks, and transport materials from distant sources. Then, armies of skilled craftsmen, stonemasons, brickmakers, carpenters, and artists would execute the precise work of construction. The organization was military in its precision. Overseers with clay tablets kept meticulous records of rations distributed, work quotas met, and materials used. Feeding, housing, and managing this vast workforce was a logistical feat as impressive as the construction itself, proving that the state could coordinate human effort on a scale previously unimaginable. The sourcing of materials tells a story of an empire that reached far and wide. The cedar wood for the great roof beams and doors did not come from local date palms. It was imported from the distant Amanus Mountains in modern-day Turkey. This prized timber was floated down the Euphrates on great rafts, a journey of hundreds of miles. The diorite and limestone for statues and foundation stones were quarried in Magan and the Taurus Mountains. Using these exotic, imported materials was a deliberate choice. It showed everyone that the empire's reach extended to the very ends of the known world, and that it could command the finest resources from every corner of its domain. A visitor to Akkad would see stone and wood that were utterly foreign to the Mesopotamian plain, a tangible demonstration of the empire's boundless power and wealth. This architectural philosophy extended beyond the capital to the provinces, where it served a crucial function of control. In strategically important or recently conquered cities, Sargon's governors would embark on their own building programs, constructing fortified palaces and administrative centers that mirrored the style of Akkad, albeit on a smaller scale. At the site of Tel Brak in modern Syria, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of a massive Akkadian fortress palace, known as the Brak Oval. Its thick, intimidating walls and centralized plan are a clear imposition of Akkadian architectural will on the local landscape. For the local population, this new, alien structure dominating their city was a daily, unavoidable reminder of who was in charge. It was a garrison of power made of brick and stone, a symbol that the old ways of local rule were over, replaced by the unyielding authority of a distant emperor. The legacy of this architectural blueprint is one of the most visible threads connecting Sargon to the empires that followed. The ziggurats of Babylon, including the legendary Etemenanki that likely inspired the Tower of Babel story, were direct descendants of the tradition of building massive, elevated religious and political centers. The Great Terrace built palaces of the Persian Empire at Persepolis, with their vast Appadana halls supported by countless columns, echoed Sargon's use of architecture to humiliate and impress visitors. Even the Roman Forum, with its temples and basilicas arranged to showcase the power of the state, operated on the same fundamental principle that Sargon had established, that the built environment is the most powerful and enduring form of propaganda. He proved that by shaping the physical world on a heroic scale, you can shape the human mind, convincing generations that your authority is as natural, as permanent, and as formidable as the very ground they walk on. But beyond the clatter of swords and the imposing walls of his cities, Sargon was also a master of a much quieter, yet equally potent, form of conquest, the conquest of commerce. He understood that while an army could seize a territory, it was the steady, reliable flow of trade that could truly win over a people and bind distant lands to your will in a web of mutual benefit. This was the art of trade diplomacy, a sophisticated strategy where merchants were as important as soldiers, and a bale of wool or a block of lapis lazuli could be as influential as a regiment of spearmen. Envision his envoys not as warriors, but as well-dressed diplomats and shrewd merchants, traveling routes that stretched far beyond the empire's official borders, carrying with them not just goods, but the very reputation and influence of Akkad itself. Their mission was to forge agreements with powerful, independent lands like Dilmun, the ancient trading hub in what is now Bahrain, and Magan in modern-day Oman. These weren't simple shopping trips for exotic trinkets. They were high-stakes negotiations to secure access to materials that were absolutely vital to the empire's prestige and power. From Dilmun came gleaming pearls from the Gulf and finely crafted copper goods. From Magan came vast quantities of the copper ore itself, along with the hard, beautiful diorite stone used for royal statues intended to last for eternity. By establishing formal trade relations with these distant powers, Sargon wasn't just enriching his treasury, he was building a network of economic dependency. These foreign kingdoms, now reliant on the vast Mesopotamian market for their prosperity, became de facto allies. They had a vested interest in the stability and success of the Akkadian Empire because its collapse would mean the collapse of their own economy. This created a buffer of friendly, economically intertwined states around his core territories, a defensive perimeter built not on fear but on shared profit. The execution of this grand strategy relied on a highly organized system, and at its heart were the merchant guilds. These weren't just random bands of traders. They were powerful, state-sanctioned organizations that operated with the semi-official backing of the crown. Think of them as a blend of a modern multinational corporation and a diplomatic corps. Sargon's administration would grant these guilds exclusive rights to trade in certain commodities or along specific routes. In return, the merchants acted as the eyes and ears of the empire in foreign lands. A guild merchant arriving in the court of a king in the Indus Valley would note the size of his army, listen for whispers of political intrigue, and assess the strength of potential rivals. This intelligence was priceless, flowing back to Akkad alongside the cargoes of carnelian and ivory. These merchants also served as informal ambassadors. They would negotiate not just prices but also the terms of passage, the establishment of trading posts, and even preliminary agreements that would later be formalized by royal envoys. Their very presence, representing the wealth and power of Akkad, was a powerful argument for cooperation. A local ruler knew that welcoming these merchants meant access to the finest Akkadian textiles, abundant grain, and advanced bronze tools. Denying them meant being left out of the most dynamic economic network in the known world. This symbiotic relationship between the state and commerce was a key innovation, turning private enterprise into a powerful arm of foreign policy. To support this sprawling network, Sargon's administration pioneered the concept of permanent embassies, or at the very least, long-term residential trading outposts in key foreign cities. These weren't just inns for traveling officials, they were permanent installations of Akkadian influence, staffed by a mix of career diplomats, translators, and guild representatives. These outposts served multiple crucial functions. They were logistical centers where goods could be stored, contracts could be witnessed and sealed, and disputes between Akkadian and foreign merchants could be adjudicated according to a recognized set of commercial laws. They were cultural centers where the language, customs, and artistic styles of Akkad were constantly on display, slowly influencing the local elite. And they were safe havens, providing a base of operations and a piece of home for Akkadian citizens thousands of miles from the Tigris River. The very existence of these stable, permanent posts sent a clear message of commitment and stability. It told foreign powers that the Akkadian Empire was not a fleeting phenomenon, but a permanent fixture on the world stage, one that was here to do business for the long term. This reliability encouraged deeper investment and more ambitious trade agreements. as foreign kings could plan their own economies with the confidence that their partnership with Akkad was secure. Of course, this cross-cultural interaction was not without its challenges. Misunderstandings were inevitable. Differences in religious practices, social customs, and concepts of honor could easily derail a delicate negotiation or spark a violent incident. Sargon's diplomats and merchants had to be masters of cultural sensitivity as well as commerce. We have hints from various records of the careful protocols that were developed. The exchange of gifts, for instance, was a ritualized art form. A gift was never just an object, it was a symbolic representation of the relationship. Giving a gift of equal or greater value than the one you received was essential to show respect. Giving an inappropriate gift, something associated with an enemy tribe, for example, or an item considered ritually unclean, could be taken as a grave insult. Akkadian envoys were trained to understand these nuances. They learned key phrases in foreign languages and studied local etiquette to avoid causing accidental offense. When disputes did arise, perhaps over the quality of goods delivered or the terms of a contract, there were established peaceful mechanisms for resolution. Rather than letting a commercial disagreement escalate into a military confrontation, both parties would often agree to arbitration, sometimes involving a third-party merchant from a neutral city-state who was respected by both sides. This emphasis on conflict resolution through agreed-upon rules and mediation was vital for maintaining the long-term health of these international partnerships. It demonstrated that the empire valued its trade relationships enough to exercise patience and diplomacy, even when faced with provocation. The vibrant success of this trade diplomacy is etched into the archaeological record, revealing a world connected by commerce in ways that are truly astonishing. In the ruins of the royal palace at Akkad and in the homes of its elites, archaeologists have unearthed treasures that tell a global story. There is lapis lazuli, an intensely blue, semi-precious stone that could only have come from a single source: the remote mines of Badakhshan in modern-day Afghanistan. To reach Mesopotamia, this stone traveled over 1,500 miles, passing through the hands of countless traders and crossing multiple cultural boundaries. There is cedar wood, imported from the forests of the Amanus Mountains in Lebanon, used for the massive doors of temples and palaces because of its durability and fragrant scent. There is silver from Anatolia and carnelian beads from the Indus Valley civilization, meticulously drilled and polished. Each of these objects is more than just an artifact. It is a testament to a successful diplomatic agreement, a safely traversed route, and a mutually beneficial economic relationship. The flow of these goods didn't just make Akkad rich, it made it magnificent. It allowed Sargon's artisans to create art that dazzled his subjects and intimidated his rivals, and it provided his court with a level of luxury that reinforced its status as the center of the civilized world. This influx of wealth and exotic materials created a feedback loop of power, funding further military campaigns and grander building projects, which in turn expanded the empire's reach and attracted even more trade. Sargon's blueprint for trade diplomacy proved that an empire's influence could flow along the same routes as its merchants, and that a well-negotiated trade treaty could secure a frontier more effectively and far more cheaply than 1,000 soldiers stationed in a lonely fort. And so, while Sargon's envoys were busy weaving a web of economic alliances across the known world, a quieter, more profound revolution was taking place back in the heart of the empire, within the cool, dimly lit rooms of the scribble schools and the royal archives. Here, a different kind of conquest was underway, the conquest of time itself. Sargon recognized that an empire built only on force and trade was an empire living in the present moment, vulnerable to the fading memories of men and the distortions of rumor. To build something that would last, he needed to command not just the land and its resources, but the very story of his reign. His solution was to turn the act of record-keeping, once a simple tool for temple accounting, into a sophisticated instrument of state power, creating a curated, official history that would justify his rule, guide his administration, and project his legacy far into the future. Imagine the scene: a scribe hunched over a fresh tablet of damp clay, his stylus poised. He is not just a clerk, he is a builder, laying down the bricks of a narrative that would outlast palaces and armies. Under Sargon's directive, these scribes began chronicling everything with an unprecedented level of detail. It went far beyond simple lists of plunder from a conquered city. They recorded the precise number of enemy soldiers captured, the exact dimensions of a newly dug canal, the verbatim text of a treaty with a foreign king, and the daily rations of barley distributed to the thousands of laborers building the walls of Akkad. This was more than bureaucracy. It was the birth of the historical record as a deliberate act of statecraft. For the first time, a ruler was systematically creating a paper trail, or rather, a clay trail of his entire reign, ensuring that his version of events would be the one that endured. This monumental effort rested on the shoulders of a highly trained and fiercely loyal corps of scribes. Sargon's educational system, which we discussed earlier, was the engine that produced these human recording devices. But their training went beyond just learning Akkadian cuneiform. They were drilled in specific, standardized formulas for different types of documents. A report on a military campaign had to begin with a specific invocation of the gods and the king's titles. A legal judgment had to follow a prescribed format to be considered valid. This uniformity was crucial. It meant that an official in the distant province of Susa and one in the capital of Akkad were not just writing in the same language, they were thinking and reporting within the same conceptual framework. This created a seamless flow of information that could be easily aggregated, analyzed, and acted upon by the central administration. The king could look at tablets from across his realm and understand them instantly because they all followed the same bureaucratic grammar. This was information control on a grand scale, and it made governance more efficient and less prone to local misinterpretation or manipulation. The sheer volume of this documentation required a new kind of institution, the royal archive or library. Sargon's administration began systematically collecting and storing these clay tablets in organized collections, often housed within the palace complex or major temples. These were not random piles of records, they were carefully curated libraries. Tablets were often stored in labeled baskets or on shelves, sometimes with a small tag tablet on the outside describing the contents within. Scribes acted as librarians, knowing where to find a tax record from 5 years prior or a copy of a treaty with Elam. This created an institutional memory for the state. A new governor taking over a rebellious province could consult the archives to understand the history of the region, the terms of its surrender, and the specific grievances that had led to past uprisings. This allowed him to govern with knowledge, not just force. The archive became the empire's brain, a centralized repository of collective experience that prevented it from having to relearn the same lessons over and over again. But perhaps the most brilliant aspect of this system was its use as a tool for propaganda. Sargon and his scribes were masterful at crafting what we would now call the official narrative. The most famous example is a group of texts known today as the Sargon Chronicles or the Sargon Legends. These were not dry annals, they were dramatic, literary works designed for public consumption. They told the story of his miraculous birth, the infant cast into the river in a basket, saved by the divine waters, and found by a humble gardener. This origin story, likely crafted long after his rise to power, was a piece of political genius. It transformed his potentially shameful, obscure origins into a powerful myth of divine selection, setting him apart from the hereditary kings of the old city-states. Another text, his famous royal inscription, boasts, Sargon, king of Akkad, was victorious in 34 battles and destroyed their city walls. He made the ships from Meluha, the ships from Magan, and the ships from Dilmun tie up at the quay in front of Agade. This is not just a list of facts, it is a carefully constructed image of a universal ruler, a king so powerful that the entire world voluntarily comes to his doorstep to trade and pay homage. These texts were copied and distributed to temples and administrative centers across the empire. They were read aloud to officials and perhaps even to the public during festivals. They created a shared story, a foundational myth for the diverse peoples of the empire. A farmer in Sumer and a merchant in Akkad, despite their different languages and customs, would both know the same tale of Sargon's divine favor and invincible strength. This shared narrative was a powerful glue, fostering a common identity as subjects of a great and destined empire. The legacy of this historical blueprint is immense. We can see its direct descendant in the massive library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, a conscious effort to gather all the knowledge of the known world under one roof to serve the state. We see it in the Egyptian king lists, which carved the royal lineage in stone to create an unbroken, divine lineage for the pharaohs, and we see it in the Roman Empire's fasti, the official records of magistrates and triumphs, which established a clear, state-sanctioned chronology of Roman power. Sargon demonstrated that history is not just something that happens to a people, it is something that can be made, written down, and weaponized. He proved that the ruler who controls the past can command the present and secure the future, ensuring that his name, his deeds, and his version of truth would echo through the centuries, long after the dust had settled on his conquest. Yet here was a man who owed his throne not to a royal bloodline, but to his own ruthless ambition and undeniable capability. He knew from personal experience that talent could be found anywhere, often festering in obscurity, while the children of the highborn were not always the most competent stewards of power. This personal insight led to one of his most radical and stabilizing innovations, the deliberate promotion of social mobility and the creation of a proto-meritocracy. In a world rigidly structured by birthright and tradition, Sargon introduced a revolutionary concept that loyalty and skill could and should be rewarded with power, regardless of where a person was born. This was not about creating an egalitarian utopia. It was a cold, calculated strategy to build a stronger, more resilient empire. By opening the doors of his administration to talented individuals from all backgrounds, even from recently conquered populations, he accomplished several crucial objectives at once. He tapped into a vast, previously ignored reservoir of human capital, bringing fresh perspectives and diverse skills into his government. He created a powerful counterweight to the old, entrenched aristocratic families of the Sumerian city-states, whose loyalty was always suspect and whose primary interest was in restoring their own local power. And most brilliantly, he gave ambitious people throughout his empire a compelling reason to be loyal. Why would a brilliant scribe from Elam or a charismatic warrior from the northern highlands risk everything in a rebellion when the existing system offered them a legitimate and prestigious path to wealth and influence? This system transformed potential enemies into invested stakeholders. The mechanisms for identifying this talent were as practical as they were effective. Sargon and his closest advisors became talent scouts on an imperial scale, constantly on the lookout for individuals who demonstrated exceptional ability. A local administrator who efficiently organized the grain shipments from his district during a famine might be noticed in the central records and promoted to a higher position in the imperial bureaucracy. A junior officer who showed remarkable courage and tactical initiative during a campaign could be fast-tracked for an independent command. The military, in particular, became a primary engine for social advancement. A soldier who started with nothing but his spear could, through demonstrated bravery and competence, rise through the ranks to become a commander of thousands, with the land grants and status that came with it. This created an officer corps fiercely loyal to the emperor who had given them their chance, rather than to any city or tribe. For the administrative class, the scribble schools we discussed earlier were the great equalizer. A young man from a humble family, whether Akkadian or Sumerian, who showed an aptitude for numbers and language could be educated in the state academies. Upon graduation, his career prospects depended on his performance, not his parentage. He could be sent to manage a warehouse in the capital, or he could rise to become the royal accountant for an entire province. This system ensured a constant infusion of new, educated, and capable blood into the machinery of government, preventing the bureaucracy from becoming a stagnant, hereditary club. The rewards for this loyal service were substantial and designed to inspire deep commitment. A successful general might be granted a vast estate in a newly pacified territory, complete with the labor to work it, transforming him from a landless soldier into a wealthy landowner whose fortune was directly tied to the empire's stability and expansion. A skilled governor who maintained peace and increased tax revenues in his province would be showered with gifts, precious metals, fine textiles, and ceremonial weapons, and honored in public ceremonies. These were not just payments, they were powerful symbols of the emperor's favor and the tangible benefits of playing by the new rules. This created a new imperial aristocracy, one based on service and achievement rather than mere ancestry. These self-made men and their families became the most vocal champions of the Akkadian system, for it was the system itself that had created their exalted status. Of course, this meritocracy had its limits. It was not a wholesale dismantling of the social hierarchy. The very top positions, the royal family itself, the most senior military commands, and the highest religious officers still remained largely within a tight circle of trusted Akkadian elites and their kin. The system was designed to co-opt the most dangerous and talented outsiders, not to hand them the crown. Furthermore, the path was open primarily to men, and while there were exceptions like the incredibly powerful Enheduanna, her position was as much a part of her father's religious policy as it was a reward for her own personal merit. The fundamental class structure of ancient society, with a vast base of farmers, laborers, and slaves, remained largely intact. The mobility Sargon offered was a safety valve for the most ambitious and gifted individuals at the upper end of the social spectrum, a way to redirect their energies into propping up the empire rather than tearing it down. We can see the success of this policy in the archaeological and textual record. Inscriptions and administrative tablets from the period show officials with non-Akkadian and even non-Mesopotamian names holding significant positions. An Elamite named Hupitum, for instance, is recorded as a high-ranking official in the administration, overseeing large numbers of workers. This was a profound departure from the past, where such a position would have been unthinkable for a foreigner. The very presence of these individuals in the halls of power sent a clear message to every corner of the empire. If you have the talent and you pledge your loyalty to Akkad, there is a place for you here. This policy of inclusion fostered a remarkable degree of innovation and dedication. A craftsman from a conquered city, knowing his skills could earn him a position in a royal workshop, would be motivated to produce his finest work. A merchant, understanding that the empire protected his trade routes and standardized his measures, would work to expand commerce, knowing the profits would be his to keep. By valuing ability over ancestry, Sargon unlocked the human potential of his entire realm, turning the diverse talents of millions into the driving force behind his imperial project. This blueprint for a managed meritocracy became a powerful tool for every subsequent empire facing the challenge of governing diverse populations. The Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan was legendary for promoting soldiers and administrators based purely on merit, often elevating individuals from the lowest ranks of conquered tribes to the highest positions of command, a key reason for their breathtaking military success. The Ottoman Empire's Devshirme system, while brutal in its conscription of Christian boys, was ultimately a meritocracy, educating these children and advancing the most capable among them to become the empire's viziers and generals, the janissaries who owed their allegiance solely to the sultan. Even the complex bureaucracy of Imperial China, with its famed examination system, was built on the ideal, however imperfectly realized, that scholarly achievement, not noble birth, should be the path to power. Sargon's enduring lesson was that the most resilient empires are not closed fortresses, but open competitions. By giving people a ladder to climb, he gave them a reason to defend the very walls that ladder leaned against, proving that a system that rewards ambition can be far more stable than one that only inherits it. So if Sargon's blueprint was so revolutionary, what became of it after the walls of Akkad crumbled and his dynasty faded into legend? The astonishing truth is that his empire did not truly end. It simply went dormant, its core principles lying in wait like a seed, ready to sprout in the fertile soil of future ambitions. The legacy of Sargon is not found in the ruined foundations of his capital, but in the living, breathing institutions of every major empire that dared to dream of unifying the known world. You can draw a direct, unbroken line from the innovations of Akkad to the sprawling administration of Persia, the iron legions of Rome, and even the bureaucratic mandarins of Imperial China. It's as if Sargon had written the original source code for imperialism, a political and administrative operating system that subsequent rulers would simply install, customize, and reboot for their own era. Scholars who study the phenomenon of empire comparatively see the same patterns emerging again and again across thousands of years and thousands of miles, patterns that all seem to point back to that single, fertile crescent in Mesopotamia. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, under rulers like Cyrus and Darius, serves as a perfect case study in Sargon's enduring influence. When Darius the Great reorganized his vast, multi-ethnic domain, he did so by dividing it into 20 provinces called satrapies. Each satrapy was governed by a royal appointee, a satrap who collected taxes, administered justice, and raised troops. This was not a new idea. It was a refined, scaled-up version of Sargon's system of provincial governors. Just as Sargon used Akkadian as the lingua franca of his administration, Darius made Aramaic the official language of bureaucratic communication from the shores of the Aegean to the banks of the Indus. And just as Sargon built the royal road to connect his capital to outlying provinces, Darius expanded and perfected it into the famous Persian Royal Road, a highway for imperial messengers and troops that bound the empire together with stunning efficiency. The Persians were brilliant adapters, not originators of this imperial model, and the model they were adapting had been pioneered in Akkad over 1,000 years earlier. Then came the Romans, who took the blueprint and forged it in steel. The Roman concept of provincial governance is a direct intellectual descendant of Sargon's. A Roman province, like an Akkadian province, was a territorial unit governed by a magistrate appointed by and answerable to the central authority. These Roman governors, whether proconsuls or propraetors, performed almost the exact same functions as Sargon's in Cis. they upheld Roman law, collected taxes, and commanded local military forces. The Roman emphasis on codified law, from the 12 tables to the edicts of the emperors, finds a clear precedent in Sargon's early efforts to standardize justice across his diverse realms. And the legendary Roman legions, a professional standing army loyal to the state and not to any individual general, are the ultimate expression of Sargon's revolutionary military reform. The Roman soldier, equipped with standardized gear, trained in uniform tactics, and deployed along a network of fortified roads, was the spiritual successor to the Akkadian warrior who first marched under a centralized imperial banner. This legacy even traveled east, influencing the structure of imperial China. While developed independently in many respects, the Qin and Han dynasties faced the same fundamental challenges of centralization and control that Sargon had confronted. The Qin dynasty's abolition of feudalism and its creation of a centralized bureaucratic state run by appointed officials, the famous meritocratic system that would evolve into the imperial examinations, echoes Sargon's strategy of breaking local power structures and installing a loyal administrative class. The standardization that the first emperor imposed uniform weights, measures, axle lengths, and most famously, a unified script is a policy straight out of the Akkadian playbook, designed to reduce friction and enhance control across a vast and newly unified territory. Even the Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged from the conquests of Alexander the Great, themselves a blend of Greek and Persian traditions, were built upon this ancient foundation. Alexander, who reportedly slept with a copy of the Iliad and a dagger under his pillow, was emulating the heroic warrior king image that Sargon had so masterfully crafted. The successor states, like the Seleucid Empire, governed their vast Asian territories using the satrapal system they inherited from the Persians, which in turn traced its lineage back to Akkad. The city of Alexandria in Egypt, a new, planned imperial capital designed to be a center of trade, administration, and culture, is a direct conceptual heir to the city of Akkad. It was a statement in stone, declaring a new order and forcing diverse populations to reorient their lives around a fresh, central point of power. This thread continues remarkably into medieval Europe. When Charlemagne was crowned Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day in the year 800, he was, in a symbolic sense, claiming a title that stretched back through the Caesars of Rome and the Caesars of Constantinople, all the way to the first emperor who dared to claim universal dominion. The administrative divisions of his Carolingian Empire, the counties ruled by counts who were his direct agents, functioned as a medieval echo of Sargon's provincial system. The very concept of a Holy Roman Empire, a single, universal political entity sanctioned by God, is a theological and political evolution of Sargon's claim to rule by divine favor from the goddess Ishtar. The blueprint had been translated, adapted, and Christianized, but its core structure of centralized authority legitimized by divine sanction remained unmistakable. This enduring legacy demonstrates a profound truth about human history. The problems of power are remarkably consistent, and so are the solutions. The challenge of governing millions of people across diverse landscapes, of funding a massive state, and of maintaining loyalty in the face of distance and difference, forced Sargon to invent a new form of political organization. And because it worked, it became the template. Every aspiring world ruler who came after him had, in a sense, a textbook to study. They could look at the ruins of past empires or listen to the stories of their achievements and intuitively understand the necessary components: a professional army, a standardized bureaucracy, a unifying propaganda campaign, a centralized capital, and a system for managing diversity. Sargon's empire was the original prototype, the first successful experiment in building a political machine on a continental scale. His true monument is not a pile of stones in the Iraqi desert, but the very idea of empire itself, an idea that would shape the destiny of continents for the next 4,000 years. Yet for all its revolutionary brilliance, the empire Sargon built was not destined to last forever. Its very success contained the seeds of its eventual downfall, offering a cautionary tale as profound as its rise. The story of Akkad's collapse is not one of a single dramatic catastrophe, but a slow unraveling, a cascade of interconnected crises that exposed the inherent vulnerabilities in even the most advanced imperial system. It teaches us that the same strategies that enable breathtaking expansion can, if left unadapted, become the instruments of disintegration. The first and perhaps most overwhelming challenge was a force beyond any emperor's control: the climate. Around 4,200 years ago, right as the Akkadian Empire was reaching its zenith under Sargon's successors, the world was struck by a devastating megadrought known today as the 4.2 kiloyear event. This wasn't just a few dry seasons. This was a centuries-long shift in global climate that turned fertile plains into dust bowls. Tree rings and sediment cores from lakes and oceans tell a story of sudden, brutal aridity. For an empire whose entire agricultural surplus, and therefore its military and bureaucratic power, was built on the careful management of water, this was an existential threat. The intricate network of canals that Sargon had so proudly built began to run dry. The Tigris and Euphrates, the twin lifelines of Mesopotamia, saw their flows diminish dramatically. Crop yields plummeted, and the massive state granaries that had once stabilized the empire during local famines were now drained across the entire region. Famine spread, and with it came social chaos. The central government's most powerful tool, the ability to provide food and security, was suddenly rendered useless. As starvation gripped the countryside, the carefully cultivated loyalty of the provinces began to evaporate. People didn't care about imperial glory or standardized weights when their children were hungry. The old regional identities which Sargon's policies of integration had sought to soften re-emerged with a vengeance. Communities that had been bound together by the benefits of empire now turned inward, blaming the distant king in Akkad for their suffering and beginning to wonder if they might be better off on their own. This internal fragmentation created a perfect opening for external predators. From the rugged Zagros mountains to the east came the Gutians, a confederation of tribes that the Akkadians dismissed as barbarians. The Gutians were not a sophisticated military power. They did not have professional armies or complex siege engines. What they had was mobility, ferocity, and a desperate need for the resources that the drought-stricken lowlands still possessed. The Akkadian army, designed for set-piece battles and suppressing revolts in the plains, was ill-suited to fighting a guerrilla war against swift-moving mountain tribes who could strike and fade away. More critically, the empire was already bleeding from within. The professional soldiers, the backbone of Sargon's power, were now struggling to feed themselves. Logistics broke down as supply lines stretched across a landscape of scarcity. Loyalty, once guaranteed by regular pay and rations, became strained. The Gutians, exploiting these weaknesses, began to pick off the empire's outlying provinces one by one. They didn't need to conquer the mighty walls of Akkad in a single great battle. They simply had to wait for the empire to weaken itself from the inside, then move in to claim the pieces. The gut punch of external invasion was compounded by a slow erosion of the very bureaucratic machine that had made the empire so efficient. Over generations, the system Sargon created began to suffer from institutional decay. The meritocratic ideal, so revolutionary at the start, gradually gave way to the old temptations of nepotism and inherited privilege. Sons of powerful officials began to inherit their fathers' posts not through demonstrated ability, but simply through bloodline. This led to a decline in the quality of administration. Provincial governors, now less competent and more focused on enriching their own families, became corrupt. Tax revenues, the lifeblood of the state, were siphoned off into private coffers instead of funding the army and public works. The meticulous record-keeping that had allowed the central government to see everything began to falter, creating blind spots and opportunities for local power bases to re-establish themselves. The empire was losing its grip not because the blueprint was flawed, but because the human beings running it had stopped following its core principles. They were enjoying the fruits of the system without maintaining the engine that produced them. This bureaucratic sclerosis made the empire incapable of mounting a coordinated, effective response to the dual crises of climate change and invasion. A final, deeply ironic weakness was the system of dynastic succession that Sargon had instituted to ensure stability. While it provided a clear line of inheritance, it also created a brittle structure where the fate of the entire empire was tied to the capabilities of a single family. Sargon's own successors, like his grandson Naram-Sin, were powerful rulers, but the very act of declaring himself a living god, as Naram-Sin did, created a dangerous theological problem. If a god-king could be defeated, what did that say about the gods? When the empire began to falter under the weight of drought and Gutian attacks, it didn't just represent a political failure, it represented a cosmic failure. The divine mandate that had been so carefully constructed by Sargon and Enheduanna was shattered. The legitimacy of the entire dynasty crumbled along with the harvests, making it impossible for later rulers to rally their people with the same divine authority. The empire did not end with a single event, but with a whimper. The last Akkadian rulers held onto a shrinking core of territory, their power a pale shadow of Sargon's vision. The great city of Akkad itself was eventually abandoned, its location forgotten so completely that archaeologists still search for it today. The Gutians established their own short-lived dominance, and for a time it seemed the imperial experiment had failed completely. But the blueprint itself was far from dead. The lessons of Akkad's fall were as instructive as those of its rise. They taught future empire builders that centralization, while a source of great strength, also creates a single point of failure. They showed that an empire must be resilient, able to adapt to environmental shocks and economic pressures. They demonstrated that a bureaucracy must be constantly renewed and held to account, lest it become a self-serving parasite on the state it was meant to serve. And they revealed that no dynasty, no matter how divinely sanctioned, can survive if it fails to deliver the basic necessities of life to its people. The fall of Akkad was not a refutation of Sargon's blueprint, but a brutal stress test that revealed its limits. Every empire that followed, from Rome to the Mongols, would eventually face these same tests of overextension, environmental change, and internal decay. The story of Sargon's empire is therefore complete only when we consider its end, a poignant reminder that the greatest human constructions, no matter how grand their vision, are ultimately subject to the unforgiving forces of nature, time, and human fallibility. And so we reach the end of our journey, standing at the convergence of past and present, where the dust of Akkad settles to reveal a startling truth. Sargon of Akkad was more than just a king. He was history's first great architect of power, a visionary who didn't just build an empire but designed the very concept of empire itself. We have walked through the halls of his centralized bureaucracy, marched with his professional armies, and witnessed his masterful blending of cultures and faiths. Each element, from the standardized weights and measures that unified commerce to the propaganda that cast him as a divinely chosen ruler, wasn't an isolated tactic. It was an integral component of a grand, interconnected system, a political and social machine engineered for expansion and endurance. This was not a haphazard collection of conquests. It was a conscious, calculated blueprint for dominion, a masterpiece of statecraft whose core principles would be discovered, independently or through the echoes of history, by nearly every major power that followed. The Roman legions, the Persian satrapies, the Chinese imperial examinations, the vast trade networks of the Mongols, all of them, in their own way, were following a path first carved out by the ambition of one man in ancient Mesopotamia. His legacy is not merely a chapter in a history book. It is the foundational language of large-scale human organization, a set of rules for building and maintaining power that proved so effective they became virtually universal. Understanding Sargon's blueprint does more than just illuminate the past. It gives us a new lens through which to view our own world. The patterns we see in modern geopolitics, in the structure of multinational corporations, and in the strategies of global influence are often modern iterations of these ancient principles. The centralization of data in our digital age mirrors Sargon's centralization of administrative records in Akkad. Modern propaganda and public relations campaigns are the direct descendants of the myths and inscriptions he used to shape his public image. The challenges of managing diverse workforces and international markets echo his struggles with integrating Sumerians, Akkadians, and Elamites into a single, cohesive entity. This exploration invites us to become pattern seekers, to look beyond the surface of current events and recognize the deep, historical currents that shape them. The story of Sargon teaches us that the fundamentals of leadership, the need for clear systems, the importance of a compelling narrative, the balance between force and diplomacy, and the relentless pursuit of stability are timeless. His rise and the eventual decline of his empire offer a powerful, dual lesson, a testament to human ingenuity in building colossal structures of power, and a humbling reminder of their inherent fragility in the face of environmental change, internal decay, and the unpredictable tides of history. Let this deep dive into the dawn of empire inspire you to look for these blueprints everywhere, to see the hidden architecture behind the world's great successes and its most dramatic failures. We hope this journey has been as fascinating for you as it has been for us to piece together. If these stories from the deep past have sparked your curiosity, if you now see the ghost of Sargon in the strategies of leaders and organizations today, then we've done our job. Please like this video if you enjoyed it, share it with someone who loves a good mystery of history, and subscribe to the channel for more explorations into the forces and figures that have shaped our world. And we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Looking across the vast span of history, from Rome to the Mongols to the British Empire, which one do you think most perfectly embodied Sargon of Akkad's original blueprint for power?